Robb Stark sat upon a camp stool in the pavilion of battered oiled canvas, staring at the manacled figure before him. The prisoner's golden hair glinted in the dim lamplight, and there was a hollow, disdainful pride in his eyes. Jaime Lannister, Kingslayer, the man who had hurled Bran from a tower, shattering the boy's body and perhaps all hope of an easy peace. Around Robb, the lords of the North stood in tense silence. The air fairly crackled with the weight of unspoken judgments, each man judging Robb for what he was about to do or fail to do. The war had ground on for many bloody months. Men died in droves for the vengeance of House Stark. And yet, was vengeance enough? Would it bring back Ned? Could it truly save Sansa or Arya? Catelyn Stark's pale face swam in Robb's mind, as urgent as a mother's voice in a child's nightmares. He remembered her despair. "We have lost too much already, Robb," she had whispered during one of her nights of wakefulness, clutching her shawl with trembling fingers. "I fear we stand on a knife's edge. Even in victory, we lose more than we gain." And so it was. The War of the Five Kings devoured the realm like an insatiable beast. The riverlands were ravaged, the harvest trampled, the small folk terrified or starved. Winter was coming not only for the North but for all the land. If they kept fighting, so many lives would be lost, more than he could bear to count. Outside, the night was damp. The pines around the camp reeked of rain and horse sweat. Faint torchlights bobbed in the darkness. Robb couldn't help but shudder at the memory of the battles already fought. Battlefields of mud and blood, the keening wails of men gutted by steel. His men called him the Young Wolf, a warrior king to lead them to glory. He had built his reputation on cunning tactics, on capturing Jaime in the Whispering Wood and on outmaneuvering Tywin's armies. But all that cunning had led them here, to a stalemate that threatened to drag on and on. He exhaled slowly, standing and facing Jaime Lannister. The man's hands were bound. His face was gaunt from days in captivity, yet there was still that aristocratic tilt to his chin. Robb studied him for a moment, allowing the hush to stretch. Lord Rickard Karstark, the great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, and Edmure Tully all hovered nearby with various expressions. Tension bristled. Each man might have chosen to do differently were they in Robb's place. Kill the Kingslayer, use him as leverage, or keep him as a hostage to guarantee Sansa and Arya's safety. But Ned Stark's sense of honor had not died with him, and Robb felt that code, that legacy, in every breath. He remembered all too well the moment the ravens came with news from King's Landing. Sansa's pleading letters, though clearly penned under duress, said that she was alive in the Red Keep. Arya was rumored to be there as well, though no one truly knew. The Lannisters claimed to hold the sisters in gentle captivity. But how gentle could anything in King's Landing truly be under the watchful sneer of Joffrey? Letting Jaime Lannister go, trading him for an official peace, for the safe return of Sansa, and for a promise to do no further harm, felt like an idea both mad and shining. Catelyn's urging had always been, "Let us spare our people. Let us save your sisters." The alternative was to keep fighting. And if they kept fighting, how long before Tywin Lannister marched again with another fresh host? How long before the Iron Islands took advantage? How long before the Tyrells or the Baratheon factions joined, and the tide of war shifted anew? Robb cleared his throat. "Kingslayer," he said, in a voice that wanted to waver but did not. "You know why you still live. You know that my father was killed at the command of your whelp of a king. My sisters remain at the mercy of your family. Their well-being depends on your father's grace, if he has any. Perhaps Joffrey's good mood, if he has any." His voice dipped on that last point, and somewhere behind him, Rickard Karstark grunted with disapproval. Karstark had more reason than most to hate Jaime, for Jaime had cut down Karstark's own son in battle. Jaime lifted his chin, allowing a suggestion of a sneer. "I know that you require assurances, my Lord Stark. I also know that my father is a man who honors bargains, once they're made in earnest." His voice rasped faintly, and Robb wondered if he had eaten well in the past days. "Likely not. You speak of Lord Tywin's honor as though it were a coin in your pocket," Robb answered. "The word of House Lannister has not always proven faithful. Jaime's eyes flickered. If you aim to make peace, you need an exchange of trust. You keep me here, I am useless to you beyond leverage, and you remain as you are, locked in battle. Release me, and let me carry your terms to my father. I will see it done, for my own sake if not for yours. He held Robb's gaze. I want to live, Stark. If that is enough to convince you, we might all end this wretched conflict. Robb felt every eye upon him. Karstark's simmering fury, Edmure Tully's anxious hope, the Great John's war-hungry misgivings. He could almost hear Catelyn's repeated plea echoing in his skull. We cannot keep risking Sansa's life. The game grows too dangerous. The realm was in dire straits. Robb recalled that the last letters from Winterfell had grown less frequent, and he worried. Bran was in charge there, with Rickon, under the watchful care of Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick Castle. Yet war had a way of creeping into the remotest corners. Maybe securing peace with the Lannisters would mean fewer armies prowling across the countryside. He bent down and gripped the hilt of his sword. Ice was lost, taken from Ned in King's Landing, so he carried a different sword now, a castle-forged blade, not Valyrian steel. But the weight reminded him of all he had inherited. Very well, Robb said, voice taut. Here is how it shall be. I will release you, Jaime Lannister. You will ride south under guard, with my own men ensuring your safe arrival to your father's halls. In exchange, your father will send me Sansa and Arya, both of them alive and unharmed, and he will recognize that the North's hostilities are ended. We will sign a treaty binding us to mutual peace, and we will call back our armies. The Riverlands will be recognized as under the protection of the Starks and Tullis, not the Iron Throne. Lord Tywin must cede the Riverlands from further Lannister aggression, and we will vow not to march any further south unless threatened. Is that something your father might accept? Karstark made a harsh sound as if about to protest. Robb waved him into silence. Jaime Lannister gave a small, brittle laugh, as if he could scarcely believe what he was hearing. You are bold, boy. I am king in the north, Robb replied, aware that it was a precarious claim at best. And I would have peace for my people. Jaime's chains rattled as he sat back on his heels, regarding Robb with pale green eyes. I cannot promise what my father will do, he said, but I can promise that he wants me free. I can promise that if it is your sisters he must return, then that is a small price for Lord Tywin to pay. He wants the realms at peace so that House Lannister might maintain its hold on King's Landing without further annoyance. He has bigger concerns, the Tyrells, the Baratheons, old Stannis with his stubborn claims. And if you remove yourself from the field, well... His grin slid across his face like an unsheathed dagger. That's one less wolf to worry about, yes? Robb straightened his shoulders, ignoring that mocking edge. I have your word, then? You have my word, said Jaime Lannister solemnly enough. Swear it by the gods. Jaime's grin bent wryly. You have your old gods, I have the 7. But if it pleases you, I swear by them. I swear I will do all in my power to see your sisters return safe, and that Tywin Lannister sues for peace if you return me to him now. Karstark let out a curse, and the great Jon Umber growled deep in his chest, but Robb held firm. He nodded to Roose Bolton, who lingered in the shadows, silent and cold as a snake. Prepare the terms. We shall set him free at dawn. A profound silence followed. It was only shattered when Robb left the tent, letting the cool night air strike him full in the face. If this was folly, at least it was a folly born of hope. Even as the dawn broke pink across the eastern sky, the northern camp seemed subdued, bristling with tension. Many men eyed their young king with question, if not accusation. Word had spread in the night. Robb Stark had decided to release the Kingslayer. Some thought it unthinkable, a betrayal of the North's cause, of justice, of honor. Others felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this was an end to the bloodshed. Still others were furious. Robb worried about Karstark especially. The man had lost 2 sons, cut down by Jaime's own sword, and was left with only vengeance to keep him warm at night. Yet, Robb also recalled his father's lessons. Sometimes, to spare 1,000 lives, One must strike a bargain with one's foe. Caitlin found Robb near the makeshift paddock where the horses awaited. "Robb," she said in a low voice. Her eyes were rimmed with red, as if she had not slept. "Is this the right choice?" He turned and offered a faint, worn smile. "I want my sisters back, Mother. I want no more Northerners burned, no more river lords forced from their lands. If peace can be had through one bold gesture, I must try." She hesitated, tears threatening. "I know. I only—" She shook her head and pulled him into a sudden embrace. "I pray it is not too late to spare everyone else we love." When they separated, Roose Bolton arrived to bow, his pale eyes expressionless. "My liege, the Lannister is ready to depart. We have prepared a strong escort to see him safely to the outskirts of the Westerlands. There, another contingent of his father's men awaits to finalize the exchange of custody." Bolton seemed neither for nor against the plan, so calm in his readiness to do as he was bid. Robb allowed himself to be momentarily unnerved. He nodded. The camp was set at the edge of a broad, shallow river, with the morning light dancing on the ripples. A line of horsemen awaited them, a half-dozen hand-picked Northmen, all with stern faces and excellent skill at arms, for the journey would not be without risk. Jaime Lannister stood in the middle of the group, unchained but with thick ropes circled around his wrists, trailing enough slack to let him ride. His clothes had been replaced with a modest traveling outfit, but he still stood out from the Northmen with his proud posture. Nearby, his warhorse waited, a glossy destrier that pawed the ground. Rickard Karstark hovered behind the line of horses, face like storm clouds, fists balled at his sides. When Robb approached, Karstark spoke in a low, heated undertone. "You are making a grave mistake, Your Grace. The Kingslayer deserves the headsman's sword, not freedom. He murdered my son. My grief demands blood." Robb felt the pang of sympathy in his chest. "I do not forget your loss, my lord, nor do I belittle it. But I must do what I believe is best for the realm, and for my sisters. The Lannisters will return them. I can't jeopardize that." Karstark's jaw muscles nodded. "He will bring us only more harm. I promise you that. If you let him slip away, we will all regret it." "I pray not," Robb said. "But if you cannot accept that, I can only ask you to trust your king." Karstark stared at him for a moment, fury swirling in his eyes. Then he turned, heaving in a sharp breath, and stalked away. Robb felt as if part of him cracked inside. He had respected Karstark's devotion. That man had followed Ned Stark in countless campaigns. But perhaps the weight of vengeance was too much to set aside. Robb only hoped that one day, peace might numb that anger. He swung up onto his own horse, guiding it alongside Jaime. The Lannister knight favored him with an inscrutable look. "I never thought the North produced men quite so unorthodox." "My compliments, Your Grace." Robb didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hand, spurring his horse into a forward walk. The Northman escort fell into formation around Jaime, with Roose Bolton at the fore. Edmure Tully stood off to the side, watching them with the same grave worry that afflicted everyone else. Their procession left the camp and headed southward, along the old high road that cut through the riverlands. The early morning sunlight grew stronger, glinting off their armor, warming the damp air. Robb felt a strange mixture of dread and hope thrum in his veins. The plan was this. They would ride with Jaime for 3 days until they reached the designated crossing near the border of the Westerlands, where Tywin Lannister's men would meet them. No harm was to come to Jaime in that time. If any ambush or trick was attempted, Robb's men were to ride away with Jaime still in their custody. That was the deal. The first day passed almost in a haze of tension. They traveled dusty roads that wound through farmland burned and pillaged in earlier battles. Charred cottages stood as blackened skeletons in the morning sun. Now and then, the men would pass a handful of peasants, who scattered at the sight of knights and lords. Robb tried not to dwell on the horrors the small folk had endured. He had always known war was cruel, but to see the devastation firsthand renewed his resolve to broker peace. They camped that evening in a grove of oak and ash. Jaime was kept within sight at all times, though not harshly. He was given food, a salted haunch of pork, some stale bread, a bit of cheese, and water more generously than typical for a prisoner. As the stars came out, Jaime's voice carried on the still air, bantering with the guard who watched him. Robb was thankful there had been no trouble yet, but inside he worried. There was no telling how Tywin Lannister might interpret this move. Peace might sound appealing, but Tywin's sense of pride and strategy was legendary. Would he truly release Sansa and Arya, or was he playing at something deeper? On the second day, they rode through the Riverlands and encountered a column of refugees fleeing further south. Hollow-eyed men and women, with children in tow, dragging battered carts of possessions and livestock. Roose Bolton and Robb led the way carefully around them. The frightened refugees stared, uncertain which side these knights might represent. Jaime smirked ironically at them. "If they only knew their so-called kings are more frightened than they are," he remarked softly. Robb said nothing, but inside he recognized the simple truth. The realm was ravaged, and the lords who warred over it were scrambling for advantage. That night, as they camped near the banks of a wide stream, Jaime asked to speak with Robb in private. The Northman hesitated, but Robb nodded. They took a few steps away from the main campfire to where the moonlight illuminated the rushing water. The rest of the guard lurked close enough to intervene if the Kingslayer tried anything. Jaime winced as he settled onto a fallen log, clearly still in pain from lingering injuries. When he looked at Robb, his expression seemed uncharacteristically serious. "I wonder," he said softly, "why you truly do this. Your father was an honorable man, but not a fool. Have you considered that your father's sense of duty might not survive in a war-torn realm?" Robb tensed. "I have considered everything, Lannister. I do this because I want my sisters safe, because the North has bled enough. If you think it naive, so be it." Jaime regarded him curiously. Naive? Perhaps. But sometimes naive men do bold things that shake the world. "I will give you one piece of advice. Don't expect my father to treat you with the same moral code you hold dear. He's a cunning old lion. If you sign a treaty with him, he will hold to it only as long as it benefits him. But if you do get your sisters back, I suppose that's all that truly matters." Robb's gaze hardened. "If he breaks the treaty, I will bring my armies south again. That is the risk, yes, but I must believe that he values you enough to ensure peace. If you truly are the golden son your family cherishes." Jaime's smile turned thin. "Golden, yes, cherished, less certain. But I do know Tywin Lannister doesn't like to lose. He lost me at the Whispering Wood. He won't like losing again." Robb found himself unexpectedly exhausted by Jaime's half-honest musings. "In the end, I trust my father's memory to guide me," he said. "That is all I have." Jaime nodded, a flicker of something like sympathy in his eyes, then said nothing more. On the third day, the landscape changed. Towering hills rose around them, their slopes dotted with hardy shrubs, and the stony soil signaled they were nearing the Westerlands. The tension coiled tighter in the northern guard. At midday, they reached the designated crossing, an old stone bridge over a swift river, overshadowed by a rocky ridge. Far across the bridge, they could see banners snapping in the wind, bright crimson with the golden lion of Lannister. Robb signaled a halt. Roose Bolton stepped forward to speak in low tones. "Your Grace, we proceed with caution. Let me take a few men and confirm no ambush waits." Robb nodded, throat tight. He looked toward the far side. If the Lannisters tried anything, the short-sightedness of it would be absurd. Jaime Lannister was still in their care, but paranoia was a stubborn weed. Bolton took a small group and advanced slowly across the bridge. A single Lannister outrider came to meet them under a white flag. There were a few tense minutes of conversation while Robb waited with the remainder of the escort. Jaime said nothing, though his eyes scanned the hillside with the vigilance of a skilled knight. Eventually, Bolton returned, expression smooth and measured. "They agree to the terms," he said. "We will hand over Ser Jaime to their custody. One of their knights will ride across with a letter from Lord Tywin. detailing his acceptance and promising the exchange of your sisters at Riverrun within the fortnight. We shall see if it is genuine. Robb's heart pounded. We shall see indeed. They led Jaime forward to the center of the bridge, where a cluster of men from both sides gathered. Robb dismounted, and so did Jaime, the latter still bound by ropes around his wrists. The Lannister outrider, a lean man with a face pitted by old scars, produced a sealed parchment. He extended it to Robb, who took it and broke the wax seal. Within, in Tywin Lannister's precise script, were words of acceptance. He agreed to meet the demands for a ceasefire with the North, promised the immediate release of Sansa and Arya Stark, provided they were both still in the custody of the crown, and recognized the neutrality of the Riverlands for now. If all conditions were met, Tywin demanded that Robb stand down his forces and swear never again to take arms against the Iron Throne unless attacked first. Robb read it carefully. He felt as if ice formed in his blood when he reached the line. Lady Arya Stark's whereabouts remain uncertain, but if found, she will be returned. That was a blow. Yet this was not unexpected. Arya was missing, or so the rumors said. No one had seen her in weeks, but there it was, set in ink. Tywin claimed ignorance of her location. Still, the letter promised to do everything possible to locate her if she was within reach. Sansa apparently was definitely at the Red Keep. She would be released to Robb's representatives at Riverrun as soon as Jaime arrived safely in King's Landing. It was not perfect, but it was more than he had dared hope for. And it was a path to peace. With a steady hand, Robb nodded and handed the parchment to Roose Bolton for confirmation. That is my father's seal, Jaime said. His word, for what it's worth. You might not get everything you want, Stark, but it ends the war at least. It better, Robb answered quietly. Bolton returned the parchment to Robb. It appears in order, Your Grace. Robb turned to the Kingslayer and, after a breath, reached forward to untie the ropes himself. Jaime rubbed his wrists with a wince. The Northmen stood around them, anxious, but none moved to interfere. You are free, Jaime Lannister, Robb said. Under the terms of this treaty, if my sisters come to harm, if the Lannisters break their word, I swear you will see the full wrath of the North again. Jaime's mouth quirked. I believe you, Your Grace. He looked over his shoulder at the cluster of Lannister men. Have you a horse for me? A black courser was led forward. Jaime stepped away from Robb and mounted with a graceful swing of his legs. He glanced back at Robb one last time. No sneer on his face now, only a searching look. Then he turned and spurred the horse across the bridge, leading the retinue of Lannister armsmen. Robb watched them go, dust pluming behind, until they rounded a bend and disappeared from sight. Roose Bolton was the first to speak. We have done our part. Now we wait to see if Tywin Lannister is as good as his word. Robb tucked the parchment into his belt pouch. Yes, he said heavily. Now we wait. The waiting was an agony. They returned to Riverrun, where Catelyn and Edmure Tully awaited them. Lord Hoster Tully was on his deathbed, his mind drifting in and out of lucidity. Lady Catelyn spent hours beside him, but when Robb arrived, she anxiously sought him out. She read Tywin's letter twice, pursed her lips and murmured, He claims ignorance of Arya's whereabouts. It's possible Arya escaped, Robb said, summoning some hope, or that she's hidden among the common folk. We know she vanished after Father's execution. If she's not in Lannister hands, they can't produce her. Catelyn closed her eyes. We must trust the gods for her sake. At least, I pray that our enemies will not lie about Sansa's safety. They do have her. She writes occasionally, so they cannot deny that. She looked at Robb with all a mother's concern. You have done this for love of your sisters. I only hope it is enough. Meanwhile, the lords of the North murmured among themselves. Great John Umber was uneasy, uncertain if the war should be halted. Rickard Karstark was openly bitter, refusing to attend the small councils. Robb bore all these tensions as best he could while they waited for word from King's Landing. He sent ravens to Winterfell, urging Bran to maintain defenses in the north but to plan for peace. The Boy Lord would do his best, but Robb worried about the Ironborn. For Balon Greyjoy might see a chance to strike the North's coasts if the war with the Lannisters ended. The realm's troubles were manifold, never so simple as one war or one treaty. Days turned into a fortnight. The nights grew colder, the days shorter, as autumn marched on. Riverlords trickled into Riverrun with their grievances. Crops burned, homesteads destroyed, people lost or killed. Robb did what he could to lighten their burdens, but he had no illusions that a swift peace with the Lannisters would mend everything. They needed time to rebuild. They needed, ironically, King's Landing to back off. They needed the entire realm to catch its breath. At long last, near the end of the second fortnight, a Lannister envoy arrived at Riverrun's gates bearing the Golden Lion banner. They were small in number, clearly a diplomatic party rather than a war band, and with them traveled a cloaked figure on a dainty mare. When they were ushered into the great hall of Riverrun, Robb stood on the dais with Edmure Tully at his side. Catelyn sat near them, her face pale. The Lannister envoy, a knight called Ser Flemont Brax, stepped forward and addressed the assembled. In the name of King Joffrey Baratheon, the first of his name, and Lord Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King, we come bearing terms of peace, and a member of House Stark, safely returned as promised. He waved a hand behind him, beckoning a figure to move forward. Catelyn rose. Robb felt his heart hammer in his chest as the cloaked figure pulled back the hood, revealing the frightened face of Sansa Stark. She was paler, thinner than he remembered, but it was Sansa, tears brimming in her blue eyes. She saw her mother and brother and let out a small gasp of relief, her lips trembling. "Sansa!" Catelyn cried, rushing forward, ignoring all protocol. She swept her daughter into her arms, and Sansa's face crumpled with sobs. A wave of relief washed through Robb, so profound that his own eyes stung with tears he dared not let fall in front of the hall. At least one sister was safe. Ser Flemont Brax coughed gently. "Lady Sansa is returned. As for your other sister, we regret to say we do not know her whereabouts. The Crown has posted search parties, and if she is found, we will relinquish her to your care. In the meantime, my lord, here is a formal document of truce, drawn up and signed by Lord Tywin Lannister and sealed by King Joffrey." He stepped forward, giving a flourish of parchment. Robb took it and scanned the lines. It echoed the letter from before, but now with official stamps. The North would hold no claim upon the Iron Throne, would not join any rebel cause, and in return Joffrey graciously recognized the security of the Riverlands under House Tully and House Stark's protection, so long as they did not threaten the crown. Sansa was returned, though forced to renounce her betrothal to King Joffrey. Arya was promised, if found. Jaime Lannister had been welcomed back to King's Landing in good health, so the exchange was complete. The war between Stark and Lannister at least was ended. "Then we have a peace," Robb said quietly, mindful of every eye upon him. "So long as this is honored." He felt the tension in the air. The Great John was present, arms folded, scowling. Rickard Karstark was nowhere to be seen. Others murmured among themselves, uncertain. But the news that Sansa was safe served as a powerful salve on the moment. "Yes, your grace," said Ser Flemont. "May the gods see that this is the end of bloodshed between our houses." Catelyn did not let go of Sansa's hand the entire time. The poor girl trembled, but she managed a small, grateful smile at Robb. "Thank you, brother," she whispered. "Mother." Her eyes shone. "We are together again." Robb kissed her forehead gently, an outpouring of love. "We are little sister," he said, though in truth Sansa was not so little anymore. War had a cruel way of aging children too fast. "We have much to discuss, and you must rest." "Yes," said Catelyn, her eyes full of tears. "Rest and then speak. We want to hear everything, but first, we must see you fed and clothed warmly. You're home now." Sansa let out a shaky breath of relief and nodded. She held on to her mother's hand. Thus, in the great hall of Riverrun, the war between the North and the Lannisters came to an official end, sealed by the presence of Sansa Stark, returned from the Red Keep. Yet the realm was far from peace. Almost at once, new conflicts began to surface. Stannis Baratheon at Dragonstone, refused to acknowledge Joffrey Baratheon as legitimate. Renly Baratheon had already attempted to crown himself and had the backing of the Tyrells. Rumors flew that Renly had been assassinated in some dark magic ritual, that the Tyrell forces had defected to King's Landing, forging an alliance by wedding Margaery Tyrell to King Joffrey. Meanwhile, the Ironborn were said to be gathering ships, sniffing for weakness along the coasts of the North and the Westerlands alike. In Riverrun's council chamber, Robb and Catelyn conferred with Edmure, the Great John, Bolton, and others to assess their next moves. The new treaty with the Lannisters had no stipulations that the North must fight the Baratheons or swear fealty to Joffrey, only that the North would remain neutral in the ongoing power struggle. Still, there was an unspoken sense that if the Lannisters were threatened, they might call on the North to uphold the peace. "I never agreed to fight for them," Robb said firmly, "only not to fight against them. If Lord Tywin tries to force our hand, we will remind him that a treaty of non-aggression is not an oath of fealty." The Great John, fists on the table, grunted his approval. "I will do as we like. The Lannisters paid their ransom with the girl. They'll not ask for more." Roose Bolton narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. "They might. They do not want a strong North that stands outside their influence. The Greyjoys are a threat to them as well, and they may demand or request our help in subduing Pike if the Ironborn begin raiding again." Robb felt the stirrings of a headache. "We shall cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, the fighting in the Riverlands stops. Let us see to rebuilding what we can. Send outriders to the smaller holds, ensure the bandits have been driven off, try to restore farmland. These people have suffered. Let them see that the king in the North has not forgotten them." Catelyn nodded her agreement. "Yes, we must show them that House Stark's sense of justice is intact." Despite these practical matters, a quieter drama simmered. Rickard Karstark's open discontent. He had refused to attend the peace ceremony, had ridden away from Riverrun with his men soon after. He had lost his sons to Jaime Lannister, and he found no satisfaction in an exchange that let their killer go free. Word reached Robb that Karstark was holed up in one of the lesser keeps near the Red Fork, his men sullen and angry, muttering of betrayal by their liege. Robb knew he should seek out the grieving lord, but he feared that no words would ease Karstark's rage. Instead, he sent a message of condolence and of thanks for Karstark's service, urging him to remain loyal. The next weeks became a flurry of administration, distributing grain to villages in the Riverlands, reorganizing the northern lords to prepare for an eventual return home, and solidifying the new lines of neutrality. The phrase, opportunistic as ever, hovered on the edges, uncertain if they should align with the Lannisters or maintain their bargain with the Starks. Walder Frey demanded compensation for missed betrothals, or so he claimed, and Edmure Tully scowled at the old man's cawing. Robb was forced into delicate negotiations, feeling all too young for the webs of politics. Meanwhile, Sansa slowly recovered. She was still reserved, at times waking from nightmares. Catelyn would hold her and sing softly, as if Sansa were a little girl again. Robb glimpsed in Sansa's eyes a profound anxiety. The Red Keep had left scars he might never fully know. He asked her gently one evening, "Did they hurt you?" She swallowed, shaking her head. "Only with words, mostly. The Queen used to belittle me, and Joffrey—" She trembled slightly. "He would threaten me. He would have the Kingsguard beat me if he felt displeased. But I survived. I kept my courtesy. I told myself, I am Sansa Stark of Winterfell, and one day I will see my mother and brother again. And now I have." A slight smile ghosted her lips, fragile but brave. Robb felt a surge of protective fury, but it was too late to exact vengeance on Joffrey for every humiliation. Sansa was safe, and that was the victory. Still, inside, he harbored a cold anger that would not easily fade. If Joffrey so much as tried to draw them back into war, Robb would remember. Days lengthened into weeks, and the realm shifted like quicksand. The news from the south was a swirl of rumors. Stannis had attacked King's Landing and been repelled with wildfire. Margaery Tyrell was betrothed, or now married, to Joffrey. The Lannisters had new allies in Highgarden, which meant they were stronger than before. The Riverlands, still battered, benefited from the absence of Lannister raiders, at least for now. The Northmen began trickling home, though some remained to garrison key positions. Edmure took pride in gradually restoring the Tully dominion. Yet, for all the outward calm, Robb felt unsettled. He had chosen a path of peace, sacrificing the opportunity to march on King's Landing, to avenge Ned, to punish the Lannisters more fully. He had done it to save Sansa and hopefully Arya, and to spare the North from further ruin. But was it enough? Had he sold his father's vengeance too cheaply? He recalled how Ned would speak of duty, of how a lord's first responsibility was to his people. Perhaps that was the answer. He had done his duty, but that did not dull the ache of unresolved injustice. One gray dawn, he stood atop the walls of Riverrun, gazing over the mist-shrouded river, lost in thought. A soft shuffle of feet behind him signaled Catelyn's approach. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've hardly slept," she said gently. "Let go of some burdens, my son." He exhaled. "I have regrets. I wonder if father would have done the same." Catelyn looked into the distance, eyes weary. He might have. He was not blind to the realities of war. He wanted to protect his family. If you had not freed Jaime, Sansa would likely still be in King's Landing, at Joffrey's mercy. Perhaps we would never see her again. Arya might remain lost, but at least we have done all we could. Besides, if the Lannisters hold her, they have no reason now to harm her. And if they do not hold her, the realm will eventually reveal her whereabouts. We will find her. Robb smiled sadly. "Thank you, Mother." She squeezed his hand. "We have one child returned safely. That is a blessing, and it could have been otherwise. The gods know we cannot bring back those who are dead. But we have the living to care for." Behind them, the swirl of the day's business began, with servants, soldiers, and visiting lords moving through the courtyard. Robb sighed, turning to face the new day. Back in King's Landing, Jaime Lannister was welcomed with both relief and suspicion. Cersei raked him with worried eyes, Tyrion merely quirked an eyebrow, and Joffrey crowed that his uncle had returned victorious, though it was not exactly a victory. Tywin, however, had orchestrated the negotiations, and by reuniting Jaime with the family, he reaffirmed Lannister authority. Now the Lannisters could focus on the bigger threats, Stannis and the Tyrell alliance that demanded cunning to secure. Jaime found himself in conversation with Tyrion one evening. The dwarf sipped wine from a jeweled goblet, leaning back in a plush chair. "So," Tyrion said, "the young wolf let you go. I never thought I'd see the day." Jaime shrugged, swirling his own wine. "He wants peace. He wants to save his family. I can hardly blame him. And I have to say, the Starks are a more interesting breed than I gave them credit for." He paused. "He's not as foolish as one might think, to step away from an unwinnable war. With the Tyrells now at our side, the North never stood a chance to take King's Landing. By letting me go in exchange for his sister, Robb Stark spares his people. Perhaps that's honorable." Jaime's lips curved sardonically around the word. Tyrion regarded his brother carefully. "It seems he's inherited Ned Stark's sense of selflessness. Or at least we can't call it stupidity. The war was draining the North and the Riverlands. Now, father can claim victory or at least relief and direct his energies elsewhere." Jaime nodded. "Yes, let us hope father keeps his word not to provoke them further. If he does, I fear the young wolf might come howling again." He set down his goblet with a soft thud. "I wonder if the realm is truly better off this way, or if the next war is already brewing." Tyrion gave a short laugh. "In Westeros, the next war is always brewing. And so the uneasy peace hung over the land like a delicate tapestry, easily torn by the slightest aggression or miscalculation. In Riverrun, Sansa spent hours with her mother, telling tales of King's Landing, both the petty intrigues and the terrifying dangers. She told them how she had feared for her life after Ned Stark's execution, how Joffrey delighted in tormenting her. She recounted the humiliations in court, the whispered insults from Cersei and the ladies loyal to the Queen, the occasional kindness from Tyrion Lannister that had baffled her. Through it all, Robb listened, incensed but determined to keep the fragile peace. Sansa often asked, "What about Arya? Have you any word of her?" Sadly, they had none. Rumors placed Arya in the Riverlands, or traveling north in the guise of a boy, or hidden away in some September. No one was sure. Catelyn and Robb could only vow to keep searching. Still, life found a way of returning to a semblance of normalcy. The Riverlands lords began sowing seeds for the next harvest, rebuilding their battered keeps. The northern soldiers, freed of the pressing need to march against Lannister forces, turned their gaze homeward. One day, Robb received word that Balon Greyjoy had launched raids on the western coast of the north, near Deepwood Motte. Lady Meage Mormont was rallying the north's coastal defenses, but the threat was real. Robb recognized that the next fight might be against the Ironborn. If Tywin Lannister chose to join that fight, perhaps they could stamp out the Greyjoy rebellion swiftly, but Robb did not trust the Lannisters enough to want them in the north. He also doubted Tywin would spend resources to help the Starks hold their coasts. Neutrality cut both ways. At a council meeting, Edmure Tully scowled at the news. "We have our own troubles with outlaws and brigands. But if the Ironborn threaten the north, will you march to face them?" Robb nodded. "I must. The north is my kingdom, even if the Iron Throne has a claim. I will protect it. We have a treaty with the Lannisters to remain neutral in their wars, but we've sworn no such vow to the Greyjoys." Catelyn added, "We should secure the Riverlands from any Ironborn incursion up the Trident, but that is less likely. They strike by sea." The Great John roared his support. "We'll send the Ironborn back to their drowned god in bits. See if they like the taste of northern steel." While the Great John's enthusiasm was heartening, Robb's mind remained heavy. War with the Ironborn would mean more bloodshed, more resources spent, and the North was still weary from the Lannister conflict. Yet, it had to be done or the Ironborn would pillage the coast to ashes. Within a fortnight, Robb began mustering a portion of his forces to march north. He decided to leave a strong presence in the Riverlands to maintain order and to ensure that the Lannisters did not renege on the treaty. Edmure Tully, newly responsible for the Riverlands, offered to supply men to assist, but Robb politely declined. "You must see to your own lands, Edmure. The Greyjoy threat will be a seaborne conflict. We'll handle it. I pray the Seven see you victorious," Edmure said. "The Riverlands owes House Stark a debt for trying to protect us, and we do not forget you are king in the north." Robb smiled grimly, clapping Edmure on the shoulder. "Let us hope the realm finds some respite after this." Before departing, Robb visited Sansa in the Solar. She was sewing with her mother, a delicate bit of embroidery. She glanced up as Robb entered, setting aside her needlework. "You're leaving for the north?" she asked, anxiety shading her voice. He nodded, stepping closer. "We must respond to the Ironborn raids. I'll take a portion of our army. Mother will stay here with you to help Edmure restore order." Catelyn added softly, "It's safer for Sansa here than traveling north with an army, especially if the Greyjoys might threaten your route." Sansa's eyes flicked between them. "Yes, I understand. I only wish we didn't have to be separated again, now that we've just been reunited." Robb knelt beside her seat, taking her hand gently. "I promise I'll return once I've dealt with the Ironborn. Then we can all go home to Winterfell." Sansa's lips trembled into a small, hopeful smile. "To Winterfell. I would like that more than anything." She paused, glancing around at the stone walls of Riverrun. "But it will be strange to see it again. I've changed." Robb squeezed her hand, remembering all she must have endured. "We all have, but it's still our home." Catelyn patted Sansa's shoulder. "Be strong, my darling. Robb is doing what he must. In time, we will gather as a family in Winterfell again." The next morning, Robb led a sizable host of Northmen out of Riverrun, their banners flying, the direwolf of Stark, the roaring giant of Umber, the sunburst of Karstark, though Rickard Karstark did not appear in person. Robb worried over the Karstark defection but pushed it aside for the moment. They rode north, crossing the Neck, pushing toward Moat Cailin. Along the way, small folk looked on with weary curiosity. Some cheered the king in the north, others were too beaten down by war to care. When they finally reached Moat Caelan's moss-covered ruin, they found it lightly garrisoned by men from the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton's men had kept watch while the main armies were in the south. Robb paused there to gather intelligence on the Ironborn raids. Reports indicated that the Ironborn had seized Deepwood Motte, capturing it in a swift attack. Asha Greyjoy, Balon's daughter, was rumored to be leading the incursion. Robb's jaw clenched. Another castle lost. This would not be easy. The northern lords muttered their dismay, but also their readiness to reclaim Deepwood Motte. Lady Meage Mormont was said to be raising a force to take it back, but she needed Robb's reinforcements to succeed. So onward they marched. The journey tested the men's resilience. The swampy roads of the Neck gave way to the harsher terrain of the northern hills, battered by chill winds. The old gods seemed to watch silently from the ancient weirwoods, as if judging Robb's new war. And a war it was, albeit smaller in scale. The Ironborn held a portion of the northern coasts, raiding villages and capturing strategic points. They sought to earn the fear and tribute of the north, as Balon Greyjoy had always desired. Robb was determined to show them the North's strength. This was an enemy he could fight without compromise, for the Greyjoys had no hostages that might hold him back. A savage part of him relished the idea of an unambiguous foe, free from the moral dilemmas that had haunted him in the Lannister War. Still, the memory of the uneasy truce with Tywin Lannister lingered. Perhaps one day, that war would roar back to life. But for the moment it was quiet. The fate of his sisters was partly resolved, though Arya remained lost. And the price had been high, letting the Kingslayer walk free, letting the murderer of Ned Stark slip from justice. And yet, for one sister returned, for the sake of the battered North, Robb found he could live with that choice. When they finally joined with Lady Meage Mormont's men outside Deepwood Motte, Robb found the place under siege. Tense and sharpened stakes ringed the old keep. The drums of war sounded, echoing through the pines. Robb took charge of the combined forces, ensuring that supply lines were secured and that the men were well placed to prevent any Ironborn breakout. Scouts reported that Asha Greyjoy herself commanded a few hundred Ironborn inside the Motte. She was cunning, but outnumbered. Robb conferred with Meage Mormont, a burly, fierce woman who greeted him with the respect due a king. "Your Grace, we can starve them out or storm the walls. The Ironborn fight like devils, but we have the advantage of numbers. We will offer them a chance to yield," Robb said. "If they refuse, we storm the walls at dawn." He realized that, after all the moral conflict of dealing with Lannisters, he didn't want to slaughter more men unless absolutely necessary. Perhaps the Ironborn might choose to retreat or surrender, though that was not their way. They made their approach with the banner of House Stark displayed proudly. At the ramparts, a few Ironborn jeered, hurling insults. Robb called up to them, "I am Robb Stark, King in the North. I offer you a chance to lay down your arms. Surrender, and we may grant mercy." Asha Greyjoy herself appeared on the ramparts, her dark hair blowing in the sea wind, her face set in a wry smirk. "Mercy from the wolves?" she called down. "We come as conquerors, boy. Did you think we'd meekly bow?" Robb grit his teeth. "You are surrounded. No ships can reach you here. Surrender or tomorrow we attack, and no quarter will be given." Asha laughed, but the sound was bitter. "Come then. We Greyjoys thrive on the storm." She vanished from the rampart. Robb turned to Meage Mormont and nodded. "So be it." At dawn, the horns blew, and the Northmen surged forward with rams and ladders. Arrows whistled through the gray sky. The Ironborn fought fiercely, their axes and blades dripping with the blood of the first wave. But the Northmen, hardened by the Lannister War and led by the fierce Mormonts and Umbers, climbed the walls. A savage melee ensued within Deepwood Motte's courtyard. Swords clashed, men screamed and died. The wooden walls reverberated with the crash of assault. Robb, wearing a simple helm and brandishing his castle-forged sword, fought at the front. His banners snapped overhead as he carved a path through a knot of Ironborn defenders. He felt the grim satisfaction of fighting an enemy he did not have to show mercy to. This was war in its purest form, free of political entanglements, and he loathed that it gave him any sense of clarity. But it did. His men roared, "The king in the north!" as they pressed forward. The Ironborn collapsed into pockets of resistance. In the keep's upper hall, Asha Greyjoy gathered her best warriors and made a desperate stand. Robb crashed through with the Great John, their combined fury unstoppable. Axes rang against shields, men stumbled over bodies. In the end, Asha herself faced Robb. She swung her axe, and he barely parried in time. She was quick and lethal, but he was younger, stronger, and had the momentum of a victorious army behind him. Their weapons met in a fury of sparks. Finally, he disarmed her, knocking the axe from her grasp. She staggered back against a wooden pillar, chest heaving, blood matting her hair. Robb leveled his sword at her throat. "Yield," he commanded. She panted, eyes burning, but did not look afraid. "And if I yield, do I live?" Robb hesitated, thinking of how the Ironborn had tormented his people, how they had taken Deepwood Motte. He recalled Theon Greyjoy, once his friend and ward, who was not present here but was certainly complicit in these raids under his father's banner. Yet, Theon had been like a brother once, and Asha was Theon's sister. Perhaps the name Greyjoy need not be a death sentence. "Yes," Robb said at length. "Surrender, and your men will be made prisoners. The North will see you punished for your crimes, but not with a slaughter. That is the best offer you'll get." She stared at him. "So you are Ned Stark's son, after all." Then she sank to her knees, letting out a harsh breath. "Very well. I yield. The castle is yours, King in the North." With that, the Ironborn resistance collapsed. Those who still fought were cut down quickly. The rest threw down their arms. The battered fortress of Deepwood Motte was reclaimed. The direwolf banner flew over the ramparts once again, and the surviving Ironborn, including Asha Greyjoy, were taken in chains. Amid the aftermath, Robb oversaw the patching of wounds, the counting of the dead. The Great John told him, "You've done well, Your Grace. The Ironborn will fear to strike again, with their leader in our cells." But Robb knew better than to assume that Balon Greyjoy would simply give up. The man would either rage at the loss of his daughter or try to trade for her, or both. War with the Ironborn might continue, but at least, for now, the North had struck a blow. Once he was sure Deepwood Motte was secure, Robb had a sense of vindication. The Lannisters were at bay, and the Ironborn had been repelled from a major foothold. Perhaps the North could finally begin to heal. That winter, the snows began to fall more frequently in the higher latitudes, dusting the roads and forests white. Robb returned to Winterfell, accompanied by lords and men who were glad to see their home again. The castle stood, though the ravages of war had touched it lightly. Reports of robber knights and stray Ironborn had threatened the outlying villages. Bran, his younger brother, greeted him at the gate in a simple cloak of wolf fur, flanked by Maester Luwin. It warmed Robb's heart to see Bran able to stand, though with difficulty, leaning on a staff carved with direwolf heads. "I'm so glad you're home," Bran murmured. Summer, his direwolf, stood at his side. "We tried to keep everything in order. There was trouble from some Ironborn men, but they left." "Where's Mother?" Robb knelt to hug Bran carefully. "She's in Riverrun with Sansa. They'll come north soon, once the roads are safe. We've made peace with the Lannisters, for the moment." Bran's eyes widened. "Peace? Truly? For now. War might start again, but I've done what I could. Father always said it's the duty of a leader to protect his people. That's what I've tried to do." Bran nodded solemnly, as if older than his years. "I'm proud of you, Robb. Father would be too." Robb ruffled Bran's hair gently. "Thank you, little brother." He gazed around the courtyard, remembering the simpler days when he and Jon Snow used to spar with wooden swords, when Arya would run about with her wooden practice swords, mocking Sansa's ladle-like ways. A wave of longing crashed over him. He had parted from Jon at the Wall. There had been no chance to see him since. He wondered if he ever would again. Arya was missing somewhere in the wide world. But Sansa was safe, and maybe that was enough for now. Over the months that followed, Robb settled into the tasks of ruling the north during a tenuous peace. Missives came from the south about continuing turmoil. Stannis was defeated at Blackwater, apparently by Tywin and his new Tyrell allies. Joffrey reigned, though the boy king was no less a terror for it. Tyrion Lannister was rumored to have lost influence at court. Meanwhile, the Greyjoys made half-hearted raids but largely retreated to their isles, nursing their wounds. Balon Greyjoy sent a mocking demand for Asha's release, which Robb ignored. The north was battered, but not broken, and Winterfell's walls were as steady as the ancient oaks around them. In the Great Hall, each day brought new visitors, petitioners, and matters of justice. Robb did his best to reign fairly, upholding Ned Stark's memory. The Northern Lords gave him their allegiance, though some, like Karstark, still glowered from afar. One evening, as snow drifted across the battlements, a raven from Riverrun arrived. Robb read it by torchlight. It was from Catelyn, informing him that Sansa had blossomed a little, regaining some measure of peace, and that Arya's whereabouts remained unknown. Catelyn planned to escort Sansa home when the weather allowed. She also wrote that the Lannisters continued to honor the truce for the moment, but that Tywin had consolidated power in King's Landing, and Joffrey was betrothed to Margaery Tyrell. No mention was made of the North's fealty. It seemed the Lannisters were content to have one less front in the war, at least while they dealt with the aftermath of the Blackwater and the shifts in southern alliances. Robb sighed, rolling the parchment closed. This was the fruit of his bargain. A precarious, perhaps temporary peace. But it was a peace that had brought Sansa home, had spared the lives of countless Northerners, and allowed him to focus on protecting the North from the Ironborn. It had cost him the moral satisfaction of avenging his father's murder. But at times, the greatest victory was not the headsman's final blow, but the chance to safeguard those who could still be saved. Later that night, he walked alone through the Godswood, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The heart tree's white bark gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Red leaves rustled overhead, and the carved face of the old god seemed to stare at him, solemn and infinite. He knelt by the black pool, letting the cold air fill his lungs. "Father," he whispered into the stillness, "I've done what I could. I let the man who hurt us walk free. If you are watching, I hope you understand. I hope you can forgive me for not taking his head." His breath misted. The face of the heart tree offered neither rebuke nor reassurance. It simply watched as the old gods always did. Robb bowed his head, remembering that final moment when he'd untied Jaime Lannister's ropes on the bridge. The fear, the hope, the enormous leap of faith. Now, winter had come and the war had ended for the North, at least, if not for the rest of Westeros. Perhaps it was enough. Perhaps peace, any measure of it, was worth far more than the satisfaction of vengeance. In the distance, the wind sighed through the branches. In that soft hush, Robb found a quiet acceptance. Tomorrow, he would continue rebuilding the North, forging alliances with loyal lords, watching the southern realm from afar. Perhaps one day war would come again, for the Game of Thrones was not a game that ended easily. But if and when it did, he would face it with his head high, knowing he had not let the North burn for the sake of hate. He would do his duty as the king in the North, protecting his people as his father had taught him. Time rolled forward, and the North mended its wounds under the hush of falling snow. Letters came from the South sporadically. Tyrion Lannister fell out of favor with his father. Joffrey prepared to wed Margaery Tyrell. Word of a royal wedding overshadowed every corner of King's Landing. But the North paid little heed. The War of the Five Kings had effectively narrowed down, with Robb Stark renouncing the fight for the Iron Throne. Balon Greyjoy claimed kingship in his islands, but his reach was limited. Stannis lurked on Dragonstone, reeling from defeat. The Lannisters and the Tyrells commanded the capital, with Tywin Lannister as the true power behind Joffrey's throne. Winterfell's gates opened one bright, frigid morning to admit a small party under House Tully's banner. Robb came to the courtyard, wearing a heavy cloak lined with fur. His breath caught when he saw his mother, Catelyn, riding in on a mare with Sansa at her side. no longer the timid girl he'd parted from in Riverrun, but a poised young lady, wrapped in a rich cloak of dark blue wool. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her eyes shone with excitement. Robb hurried forward, helping Sansa dismount. She smiled, tears threatening as she looked around the familiar courtyard. "I'm home," she whispered. "I never thought, after everything, I'm truly home." Catelyn embraced Robb warmly, pressing her cheek to his. "We made it before the snows got too deep. The roads were difficult, but we're here." Servants bustled to help them inside, to stoke the fires in the great hall. Bran arrived, hobbling with his staff. When he saw Sansa, he brightened, and they shared a gentle hug, as ghostly as the children they once were. Rickon, that wild child, rushed about as well, though older now, less naive. For a moment, a strange, heartfelt joy filled Winterfell, reuniting siblings after so much fear and loss. They supped together that night, a small banquet to welcome the Lady and Princess of the North. The hall was hung with evergreen boughs and lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The old family dais was set for Robb, Catelyn, Sansa, Bran, and Rickon, the surviving Starks. No sign of Arya or Jon or Ned. Ghosts in their hearts, but they pressed on. The assembled lords toasted the return of the Lady Sansa Stark. After the feast, as the fires burned low, Sansa asked Robb if he would walk with her in the Godswood. He offered her his arm, and they ventured out into the snowy silence. The weirwood trees glowed faintly under the moon, and the world felt hushed, as though holding its breath. They paused by a half-frozen pool. Sansa's eyes flicked to Robb. "Thank you for saving me. I know it wasn't simple. I overheard bits of talk about a deal you made, about letting the Kingslayer go." She swallowed. "I know what he did to Bran, and it must have torn you apart to show him mercy." Robb's throat tightened. "I did what I thought was right for our people and for you and Arya. I wish we'd gotten Arya back too." Sansa's lip quivered. "I feel guilty sometimes, knowing that you might have let him go, let the Lannisters remain unpunished. For me, I know you want justice for Father. I want it too, but I'm so grateful you chose to protect me." He placed a comforting hand over hers. "Our father always said, he who passes the sentence should swing the sword. But sometimes we cannot always serve perfect justice. Sometimes we must serve the living first. I'd do it again to bring you back safely." A tear rolled down her cheek, which she quickly brushed aside. "I love you, brother." Robb pulled her into a gentle hug, the cold air swirling around them. "I love you too, Sansa. We'll find Arya. And if the Lannisters ever break their word, if they ever threaten us again, they will feel the wrath of House Stark." Sansa nodded, drawing on the warmth of his embrace. Above them, the moonlight filtered through the high branches, casting patterns on the snowy ground. The heart tree's face stared, ancient and inscrutable, bearing witness to their moment. And so, under that silent canopy, brother and sister shared a moment of unity born of heartbreak and hope. The war had taken so much, but it had not taken everything. The North still stood. They were Starks of Winterfell, bound by blood, and whatever the realm might bring, they would endure. Robb closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of pine and snow, hearing Sansa's soft breaths. For now there was peace, and with it, a chance to heal, to remember, and to cherish the family that remained. If one day the realm demanded they fight again, they would do so. But at least, for this brief interlude, the Starks had found a fragile sanctuary. Winter was coming, but they faced it together, and that, above all, was worth any price he had paid. The first snows of winter came in shy flurries, dusting the courtyard of Winterfell and whitening the needle-sharp tips of the surrounding pines. By late morning, the sky often cleared to a bright, chilled blue before the dusk closed in early. In those fleeting hours of daylight, the castle bustled as it had not done since the outbreak of war, as though trying to make up for lost time. Stables and paddocks teemed with shaggy-haired northern horses. Servants hurried across the yard with cartloads of firewood. The clang of hammers on steel rang from the armory. Inside the keep, warmth glowed from every hearth. Smoke curled from the great chimney above the great hall, bearing witness to the life that had returned to these ancient walls. In that fragile peace, the peace that Robb Stark had bought by freeing Jaime Lannister, Winterfell's halls filled with cautious hope. Sansa lingered in the solar most days, sewing or reading beside Catelyn, who wrote letter after letter to scattered bannermen and minor lords, affirming the new era. Bran oversaw matters closer to home, meeting with Maester Luwin to plan for the lean times that winter would bring. And Robb himself divided his hours between duties as king in the north and moments spent with his brothers and sister, savoring the closeness of family they had so nearly lost. Yet an undercurrent of tension lay just beneath every routine. The memory of war still clung to Winterfell's stones, haunted by the knowledge that, should the Lannisters renege on their agreement, or should Balon Greyjoy push his advantage, bloodshed might resume. For now, the North breathed, but it was the shallow, cautious breath of a man newly risen from a sickbed. News traveled slowly. Ravens arrived from Riverrun, bearing tidings about the Riverlands and the Crownlands. Tywin Lannister's hold on King Joffrey's court seemed to strengthen by the day, and the Tyrells, newly allied, sent wagons of food southward to feed King's Landing through the cold. But no threat, open or otherwise, came north. That allowed Robb a measure of relief. He turned his attentions toward his own realm, focusing on the Ironborn threat along the western coast. Winter was coming, and with it the near impossibility of large-scale campaigns. If the Greyjoys remained in their isles, the North could use these months to rebuild rather than bleed. It was the day after a light snowfall when Robb entered Winterfell's small council chamber, a modest room near the Maester's turret. A rough-hewn table dominated the space, strewn with scrolls, half-finished maps, and scraps of parchment covered in notes. The walls bore dark banners, wolf heads on gray, and old tapestries of pine forests and winter scenes. Dim winter light seeped through a narrow window, catching dust motes in its pale beam. Around the table, several northern lords had gathered. The great John Umber, still big-voiced and boisterous even in relative peace. Lady Midge Mormont, gruff and keen-eyed after her victory over the Ironborn at Deepwood Motte. Ser Roderick Castle, the white-whiskered master-at-arms who had returned to Winterfell, and Roose Bolton, as cool and watchful as ever. A hush settled as Robb took his seat at the head. "Welcome," Robb began, voice echoing in the small stone chamber. "We have matters to attend to. First, our most recent ravens from Riverrun speak of no new aggression from the Lannisters. Lord Tywin appears satisfied to have me out of the war, and we have no sign of him turning back to threaten the Riverlands." The great John snorted. "He's too busy fawning over the Tyrells, I'd wager. Lord Tywin knows the North is a tough nut to crack, especially now that winter's nearly here." His enormous fists drummed on the table. "All the better for us. My men grow restless for battle, but I keep them training, should the wolves be called to fight again." Midge Mormont gave a curt nod. "Best to stay ready. Even if the Lannisters keep to their word, there are always the Greyjoys." Robb's expression darkened. "The Greyjoys will trouble us again, no doubt. Balon may brood over his losses, but I doubt the taste for reaving has left him." Roose Bolton spoke quietly, his voice hushed, but it carried in the silence. "We hold Asha Greyjoy still, do we not? Word in the North is that her captivity has caused her father great consternation. He demands her release." Robb hesitated. His memory flickered back to the day he'd disarmed Asha in the smoke-choked yard of Deepwood Motte. For a moment, he felt the ghost of that battle, the iron tang of blood on the air. "Balon Greyjoy has offered no terms I can accept. He wants the North's recognition of his kingship of the Iron Islands, along with certain coastal holdings. He receives neither. I will not ransom her back on his terms. As it stands, she's locked in the dungeons below Winterfell, better treated than any of our folk along the stony shore were under Ironborn rule. Let him stew." A faint smile touched Midge Mormont's lips. "I'm sure she's never been so warm in her life, locked away with no sea breeze to breathe. That might be torment enough for a Greyjoy." Ser Roderick cleared his throat, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the harshness of the subject. "Your Grace, if I may, what do you plan for her long term? Should we hold her through the winter? She is Balan's daughter, after all. A valuable hostage, if used carefully. Robb let out a soft breath. Yes, a valuable hostage. We keep her for now. If we see any sign the Ironborn are reassembling to raid us again, we'll threaten to put her to trial for the murders her people committed along our coasts. That may keep Balan's reavers at bay. If, on the other hand, winter proves quiet, we can revisit the possibility of a negotiated ransom in spring. But only on terms that benefit the North. He glanced around. All eyes regarded him steadily. In the wake of the war with the Lannisters, handling Asha Greyjoy had become a test of his authority, a test of whether he could wield both justice and cunning, as his father had striven to do. He told himself that for every moment Asha sat in Winterfell's dungeon, her father would think twice about sending more men to die in the snows. The Great John grunted his approval. I like it. Keep the she-wolf of Pike in chains and let her father squirm. Bolton murmured no objection, merely lowering his pale eyes to the table. And what of our other concerns, Your Grace? Have we had any word of Lord Rickard Karstark? Robb's jaw clenched. The mention of Karstark never failed to conjure a pang of regret. Lord Rickard, still bitter from the death of his sons by Jaime Lannister's hand, had withdrawn from court life, first at Riverrun and then in the north. He had not openly rebelled, yet his men seldom answered summons. The Karstarks were scattered on their own holdings near Carhold, from which little news emerged. Ties between the Karstarks and House Stark had always been close, sharing deep kinship. Now, an uneasy wedge was driven in that bond. We've had only silence, Robb said at last. I sent him letters, invited him to rejoin us here. My mother wrote to him as well, but no reply. If he will not speak to me, I may need to ride to Carhold and face him directly. The Great John frowned. The Karstarks are old allies, but we cannot let them flout your authority, Your Grace. I won't. Not forever. Robb paused, gathering thoughts. But Karstark's grief runs deep. I promised him justice for his sons. Yet I freed the Kingslayer who slew them. He sees it as betrayal. Meage Mormont folded her muscled arms. Nothing will bring back his sons. If he chooses to hold a grudge and isolate himself, that's his right. But he won't do the realm any good. We need every sword if we're to keep the North secure against the Greyjoys. I agree with the Great John, go to Carhold if you must. Robb nodded slowly. I'll wait until after the new year. Winter roads are treacherous, and I have duties here. But yes, I must deal with him one way or another. A hush settled, broken only by the crackling of logs on the small hearth. Robb looked around, taking in the assembly of loyal lords and allies. The cost of peace weighed on them all. He rose, signaling an end to council. That's enough for today, he said. We'll see if more ravens come from the south. For now, continue your preparations for winter, keep your men at the ready, and watch for Ironborn sails. Thank you. They bowed and filed out. Roose Bolton's gaze lingered a moment on Robb before he, too, departed, footsteps silent on the stone. Robb stood alone for a moment, shoulders taut, aware of how precarious every measure of calm could be. He left the council chamber and climbed a winding staircase that led to Winterfell's main level. Servants bustled about with baskets of pine cones and dried herbs, warding off the musty chill that clung to the corridors in winter. Robb made his way toward the Great Keep, passing a handful of Stark guardsmen who snapped to attention. He offered them a nod, as graciously as Ned Stark once had to the men of Winterfell. At length, he reached a heavy door leading to the quieter wing, where the old lord's chambers had been refurbished. One door stood guarded, the entrance to the dungeon stair. Two men in Stark livery nodded. Robb paused. He wanted to see Asha Greyjoy, to remind himself of the war's grim spoils. Perhaps conversation with her might glean some insight. He gestured for one guard to open the door. They descended with a torch into the gloom. The smell of earth and cold stone thickened the air. In the deeper levels, corridors branched off to rows of cells. Most stood empty. The fighting had ended. Those who once might have filled these dungeons were either dead or had been taken to the south during the earlier, more chaotic days of conflict. But one cell contained a tall figure with dark hair tied back in a rough knot. Asha Greyjoy glanced up as Robb approached. Her expression flickered. Was it amusement or scorn? Even in captivity, she managed a stance that radiated an unbowed pride. She wore a simple woolen tunic and breeches, courtesy of Winterfell stores, and a heavy blanket lay rumpled on the straw pallet. Her cell smelled faintly of damp. She clutched the iron bars, looking out at him with a level, almost taunting gaze. "So, the king in the north pays a visit," she said, voice echoing in the narrow space. "Have you come to toss me to your wolves? Or merely to gloat?" Robb lifted the torch, illuminating her face. "I don't gloat. I came to see how you fare. It's been weeks." She barked a short laugh. "You're quite the gracious host, my lord. The food's hearty enough, and the guards keep the chill away with extra straw. I've endured worse on the deck of a longship in rough seas." Robb considered her. "You realize your father still demands your release?" Asha's mouth curved. "I'm sure he does. But Balon Greyjoy is not the type to pay ransom cheaply, and you're not the type to let me walk free. So we're at an impasse. You could help me persuade him to call off raids. If the Ironborn truly withdraw and vow not to raid our shores, I might be willing to negotiate your freedom." Robb searched her face. "Your father's not known for bending, but perhaps you have sway." Asha tilted her head. "My father trusts me more than he ever trusted my brothers, but that's not saying much. Balon's pride is as boundless as the sea. He won't simply kneel to a wolf, especially not after you turned the tables on him at Deepwood Motte." Her eyes gleamed, a mixture of grudging respect and defiance. "Look at us, Stark. You want peace again. I know you made peace with the Lannisters. Why not crush them when you had the chance? Yet you let their golden boy slip free, bartered your sister back. Might have been the wise move, but I wonder if you regret it." Robb's jaw tightened. "I spared the North from a drawn-out war we'd likely lose in the end, and I got Sansa home safe." "Practical," Asha allowed. "And with me you want the same? Peace? Surrender from the Iron Islands? Your father can keep his precious isles, so long as he leaves my people in peace. Or else, I'll drag the might of the North to his very shores. I recall the old rebellion when my father and King Robert sacked Pike. It can happen again." Asha's eyes flared at that. For the first time, her bravado dimmed. "You threaten to drown my people as well? Then you truly are like every other mainland lord. You talk of wanting peace, but you hold a knife under the table." Robb let out a long breath. "I don't seek war, Greyjoy, but I will not shrink from it if you provoke me. Winter is coming. Your father would do well to remember that. Think on it if you'd rather spend your time in these dungeons or sail free. The choice is yours, if you can sway him." He didn't wait for her reply. He handed the torch to the guard, turned, and climbed the steps back into the cleaner air of the keep. Her voice echoed behind him. "I'll remember your words, Stark," but it was impossible to tell if they were a promise or a curse. Back in the upper corridors, Robb inhaled deeply. The faint smell of roasting meat, baked bread, and a whiff of pine needle braziers enveloped him, reminders of a more civilized world. He pressed on toward the great hall, where warmth and a midday meal waited. At the high table, he found Sansa already seated beside Catelyn and a few visiting lords who had come to show fealty. Long trestle tables filled with lesser knights, warriors, and household men. The place thrummed with conversation, some cheerful, some anxious. Trenchers of roast venison, boiled onions, and brown bread were carried in by servants. Robb dropped onto the seat next to Sansa and offered a faint smile. "Hungry?" She returned a shy smile, though a shadow lingered in her blue eyes. "Starving." Then she lowered her voice, looking over the steaming food. "I overheard that you went to see our prisoner." "Asha Greyjoy," Robb confirmed, ladling stew into a bowl. "She's as defiant as ever, but she's alive, and for now that's the best we can manage." Sansa nibbled a piece of bread, not meeting his gaze. "I don't like to think of people locked in dungeons, even if they would have hurt our folk." Her time in King's Landing had made her sympathetic to prisoners and hostages, however undeserved that pity might be. But I understand. Robb sighed, drumming his fingers lightly on the table. We do what we must. For now, she's safer locked away than free to lead more raids. Catelyn glanced up from a quiet conversation with Ser Roderick. She read the tension in her children's faces. Today is a day to count our blessings, at least. There was a time when we wondered if we would all survive the war. Instead, we are gathered here, with food on our table and the North in our keeping. Sansa nodded, eyes brightening a little. She paused, looking toward the dais entrance. Bran came slowly through the side doors, leaning on his staff, Rickon beside him. A pair of guards and Hodder, that gentle giant, accompanied them. The seat next to Robb was free, and Bran carefully settled into it, setting his staff aside. Rickon plopped down on the other side, as Shaggydog's faint growl echoed from outside the hall. The direwolf wasn't allowed inside at mealtimes anymore after too many incidents chasing kitchen cats. Sansa greeted them happily, and for a moment, the Stark siblings shared a sense of normalcy. Rickon tore into a large chunk of venison, while Bran carefully spooned stew. Robb's chest tightened with mingled sorrow and gratitude, recalling the faces missing from this table. Arya lost and Jon at the wall. Ned gone forever. But at least the rest were together. That was more than many families could claim after such a war. As they ate, the Great Jon's booming laughter rolled from further down the table, overshadowing the smaller hum of conversation. It seemed, for a short while, a feast as it might have been in years past. On a crisp winter day, the Stark household united in purpose and warmed by one another's company. When the meal ended, servants began clearing the trestles, and the crowd broke into clusters. Catelyn lingered with Sansa, exchanging quiet words. Rickon dashed off to chase after the stable cats. Bran returned to his quarters to rest, accompanied by Hodder. That left Robb free to step onto the covered walk that overlooked the courtyard. Pale sunlight glimmered on the snow. He took in the bustle below. Men training, blacksmiths at work, a handful of children running across the yard in thick fur boots. A gentle footstep sounded behind him. He turned to find his mother, cloak drawn around her shoulders against the chill. She joined him at the low stone wall, gazing out over the courtyard. "I see you carry a weight on your mind," she said softly. "We have peace, Sansa is safe, and still you pace like a man expecting a knife in the back." Robb leaned forward, hands on the wall. "I suppose I am. The realm is rarely at peace for long. And my decisions were the best you could make," Catelyn finished. "I know you question yourself, but you have saved us from the fate your grandfather Hoster Tully suffered, watching his lands burned over and over again, with no end in sight. The Riverlands are wounded, but they can heal without Lannister swords at their door." Robb glanced at the gray sky. "And what if Tywin Lannister decides we are an inconvenience later? Or if the Greyjoys rally? Or if Karstark decides I'm not fit to be king and rebels?" Catelyn touched his arm, maternal concern in her eyes. "We face those challenges one by one. This is the way of kingship, Robb. The decisions never end. You cannot let them devour you from within." She paused. "I wrote again to Lord Karstark last week. He remains silent, but perhaps the snows delay his ravens. Do not abandon hope." Robb closed his eyes. "I won't," he promised, though the frustration mounted inside him. "I'll see to Carhold myself if it comes to that." A breeze ruffled the fur mantle around his shoulders. From the courtyard, the clang of steel on steel echoed. A pair of men sparring with wooden practice swords. He recognized the style of the master-at-arms from the shadow of the yard. A brief memory rose. Training with Theon, with Jon, with Arya cheering them on from the wings. So much had changed, but he was still Robb Stark. He had to be. He took a steadying breath, turning to his mother. "We should call a meeting of the Northern Lords after the new year, once the roads are passable. Renew our unity. The Manderleys, the Glovers, the Serwyns, all of them. If Karstark does not attend, that speaks volumes." Caitlin nodded. That is wise. Winter can seal off many roads, but if we plan carefully, we can gather at least the major houses. They remained there a while, mother and son, leaning on the parapet as the snow dusted their cloaks, each lost in quiet reflection. The days slipped by, the nights lengthened. Winter's deep hush settled over the north. Heavy snowfall blanketed the courtyards and draped the roofs, forcing the folk of Winterfell to dig paths and keep fires stoked around the clock. Wolves howled in the forest at night, their calls echoing through the bare branches. Food was plentiful, Winterfell stores remained well-stocked, and shipments had trickled in from White Harbor and other loyal holds. Even so, caution was the watchword. Winter in the north was never to be taken lightly. As the year's end approached, ravens brought word from the south. The Lannisters arranged the grand wedding of King Joffrey to Margaery Tyrell. Reports claimed a lavish event was planned. Feasts, tourneys, extravagant shows of wealth. To the people of the north, huddled against cold winds, it felt like a distant spectacle, as foreign as a mummer's story. Yet the wedding also signaled that King's Landing had no intention of marching north. Tywin Lannister had other priorities: consolidating his hold, forging alliances with the Reach, guarding against Stannis on Dragonstone. Good. Let him keep away, Robb thought. He read the news in the hall with Sansa present. The letter made her hands tremble. They wed so soon, she murmured. That means the Queen Regent and Lord Tywin must be planning a truly magnificent celebration. Robb frowned. Yes, no doubt. A carnival for the realm to see. Try not to let it trouble you. Sansa's face tightened, haunted by memories of King's Landing. I'm only glad I'm free of it. Margaery Tyrell. I wonder if she knows what kind of king she's marrying. Likely she has no choice, just as I once had none. Robb squeezed her hand gently. You have your freedom now. That's all that matters. He refrained from voicing his true thoughts. King Joffrey was as unstable as wildfire, and House Tyrell would learn it soon enough. For the Starks, the new year arrived in a quiet swirl of snow. The sun rose, casting pale gold on the frosted battlements. The castle folk prepared a modest feast that evening, lighting candles to chase away the darkest night. Old songs were sung around the hearth, voices echoing in the great hall. Sansa joined in tentatively, at times letting a faint smile bloom on her face. Bran listened, enthralled by the old stories of the kings of winter. Even Rickon, though restless, seemed caught by the spell of winter's hush. In the days that followed, Robb issued summons to the northern lords. Some were too far or too snowed in to travel, like the Umbers of Last Hearth or the mountain clans. Still, he hoped that at least the lords of House Serwyn, House Hornwood, House Manderly, House Bolton, and the Glovers would come. The roads might be treacherous, but the meeting could not wait for spring. Unity had to be reaffirmed. Within a fortnight, guests began to trickle through Winterfell's gates. First came Lord Wyman Manderly from White Harbor, accompanied by a modest retinue bearing barrels of salted fish and fresh-baked breads shaped like little tridents. Manderly greeted Robb with effusive praise, calling him my good young king and promising unwavering loyalty. Next arrived the Glovers, led by Galbart Glover, a grim but dependable lord who had fought bravely in the Riverlands. Then the Serwyns, the tall and serious group who had also suffered losses in the war but remained steadfast. House Hornwood had only a minor representative, as their ruling seat had been embroiled in inheritance troubles after Lord Halley's Hornwood's death. And in the midst of these arrivals came a modest party from the Dreadfort, under the pale banner of the Flayed Man, a handful of Bolton knights, though Roose Bolton was already present in Winterfell. But no Karstarks. Days passed and none came. Each time the gates clanked open, Robb felt a flicker of hope, only to see no sign of Rickard Karstark's banner. The absence spoke louder than any words. At last, the lords assembled in Winterfell's great hall for a formal gathering. Outside, a fierce wind rattled the shutters. Within, torches burned bright on sconces, and the lords stood or sat at long tables while Robb, upon a raised dais near the old seat of House Stark, addressed them. He was not crowned in gold. He wore no crown at all, only a simple circlet of bronze set with iron direwolves, forged in the old style. Still, the hall gave him the respect a king deserved. He scanned the faces before he spoke. "My lords," Robb began, "we have come through a year of war, grief, and hardship. House Stark honors your bravery and sacrifices. The war with the Lannisters has ended by treaty. We keep our borders free from their armies. We hold the Riverlands in peace, and the North remains ours to govern." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled among them. Lord Wyman Manderley folded his hands on his broad belly, looking pleased. Galbart Glover nodded, expression taut. Meej Mormont stood near the dais, arms crossed, listening. Robb continued, "Yet, new challenges face us. The Greyjoys still threaten our coasts, though for the moment they've pulled back. Our supply lines must remain strong, for winter is here and some roads will be impassable for months. We must stand as one North. Let none doubt our unity. Let none believe we can be picked apart." He let the words hang. From near the rear, the Great John's booming voice rose. "Hear, hear. The young wolf speaks true. We lost good men fighting the damned Lannisters. Now we do better to watch our own house and keep the Ironborn at bay." "Aye," chimed in Lord Manderley. "But the question remains, what of House Karstark? My riders heard no reports of Karstarks on the King's Road. Are we to consider them traitors now?" The tension in the hall sharpened like a drawn blade. Robb took a breath. "I will not name them traitors yet. Lord Rickard Karstark has cause for grief. My father died, his sons died, and he holds me accountable for releasing Jaime Lannister. I aim to travel to Karhold as soon as the roads allow, within reason, and speak with him face to face. If I can restore his loyalty, I will." Glover's gruff voice cut through. "And if you cannot?" Robb's gaze moved across the assembled lords. "Then we do what we must. The North cannot afford to let one house stand apart in bitterness. But let us hope we can mend that rift. Lord Karstark is of ancient lineage, cousins to the Starks by blood. This is a family matter." Roose Bolton, standing with folded hands, inclined his head. "A wise approach, Your Grace. Let us hope Karstark sees reason." Manderley cleared his throat. "And what of King's Landing in the meantime? We keep hearing tales that King Joffrey's wedding will be the largest spectacle in a generation. Does that pose any threat to our treaty?" Robb shook his head. "No direct threat. The Lannisters are focused inward. Our arrangement stands so long as we do not march against them or harbor their enemies. I have no intention of tangling ourselves in the next Southern War." A few grumbles arose. Some men despised the idea of letting the Lannisters sit easy, unpunished for Ned Stark's execution. But for every protest, there were other lords who recognized the necessity. Robb allowed the discussions to flow, hearing talk of supply lines, fortifications, and the distribution of winter stores. The meeting dragged long into the afternoon, lit by braziers that struggled to keep the cold at bay. When at last the assembly broke for a meal, a subdued optimism reigned. House Stark's leadership remained accepted and, for the most part, respected. The absent Karstarks cast a pall, but no one openly challenged Robb's authority. This was how the North had always worked. Pragmatic, independent, yet loyal to the name Stark when winter came. As king, Robb had to trust that foundation would hold. In the days that followed, Robb made ready for a risky journey to Karhold. The roads through the Dreadfort's territory would be the clearest path, though even that route could be choked by snowdrifts. He planned to depart with a small escort, perhaps 24 men, enough to defend themselves if threatened, but not so large as to appear an invading force. The Great John would remain at Winterfell, along with Ser Roderick, to keep the peace and manage the daily burdens. Catelyn would stay as well, along with Sansa, Bran, and Rickon. For no reason would Robb risk them on this journey into the unknown. He gathered those he trusted for the mission. Meej Mormont, whose blunt counsel was invaluable. A few knights and lords loyal beyond question, such as Dacey Mormont and Robin Flint. Roose Bolton offered to accompany him, but Robb felt uneasy about placing himself in the man's hands. Bolton's cunning was legendary. Still, refusing him outright might cause suspicion. After careful thought, Robb decided that a representative of the Dreadfort should come, but not Roose himself. He accepted Roose's son, Ramsay Snow, recently legitimized as Ramsay Bolton, if rumor held true. The latter was an unsettling proposition, for Ramsay's reputation was troubling at best. But better to keep him close and watch him, Robb reasoned, than allow him free rein. If anything, it would prove to Karstark that the North was unafraid to bring all houses to the table. And so, on a grim morning when clouds smothered the sunrise, Robb and his escort assembled in Winterfell's courtyard. The ravens had brought word of calmer weather in the east for a spell. If they hurried, they could reach Carhold while the roads were still passable. Sansa and Catelyn stood by to bid Robb farewell. Sansa clasped her fur-lined cloak tight, shivering in the cold. "Must you go?" she asked, voice small. "Could you not summon Lord Karstark here again?" Robb squeezed her hand. "I tried summoning him. He didn't come. If we ignore him, we risk a break in the North's unity. Better I go and see him myself, show him respect, and try to mend this feud." He pulled her into a quick embrace, then turned to his mother. Catelyn's eyes shone with worry, but her voice was steady. "Take care, Robb. Remember Rickard Karstark's pain, but do not let him twist the truth of your choices. Your father would wish for understanding, but also for resolve." Robb placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "I'll do my best. Hold Winterfell together for me. I'll be back before the snows close the roads completely, God's willing." The Great John slapped Robb on the back. "God speed you on your journey, Your Grace. We'll keep everything in order here. The only trouble we might face is that black-eyed prisoner in the dungeons. But she won't do much locked behind bars." Robb nodded to him in gratitude. Then he took one last look at the assembled watchers. Sansa, Catelyn, Bran in his chair, Rickon fidgeting with Shaggy Dog on a leash. A pang went through him as he swung into the saddle of his gray destrier, gray wind loping at his side. He felt the cold metal of his sword at his belt, reassuring yet heavy. "All right," he called out. "We ride east." The gates groaned open, and the party of 24 riders set forth into the snowbound lands. The hush of winter pressed close, muffling the crunch of hooves on fresh drifts. The wind had quieted somewhat, but the cold sank in deep, stinging ears and noses. They made slow progress, following the King's Road for a short distance before veering northeast on lesser trails that led toward the Dreadfort's domain. The lead scout wore heavy leathers and furs, scanning for any sign of bandits or straying wolves. It was a lonely, frozen landscape. Still, white fields, occasional stands of pine or birch, and not a soul to greet them except crows perched on naked branches. By the second day, they approached the Dreadfort's borders. Ramsay Bolton rode near the front, an unsettling smile never far from his lips. He was a slim, pallid young man with dark hair and eyes that didn't quite smile with the rest of him. He wore the flayed man's sigil on his cloak. Now and then, he asked Robb questions with a veneer of politeness. "How splendid it is to accompany the king in the north," Ramsay said one afternoon, voice low but carrying in the hush. "My father regrets he could not attend you personally. He has many burdens at Winterfell, of course." Robb forced a polite nod. "Indeed, House Bolton's presence here is welcome. We want all the North to see we are united. Karstark's been a friend to you as well, has he not?" Ramsay's face flickered with some unreadable emotion. "We hold each other in the usual courtesy. My father's domain and Carhold share no direct border. Though, I wonder what mood we'll find Rickard Karstark in." Robb's breath puffed in the cold air. "His mood is bound to be a grim one. That's why we go, words must be spoken, and we must try to heal old wounds." Ramsay's smile twitched. "Yes, old wounds. Some can fester for years if not properly tended." Robb found little comfort in the man's manner. He pressed forward, flanked by Meege Mormont and Robin Flint. Gray wind loped just beyond them, occasionally eyeing Ramsay with a silent wariness. Robb found himself trusting the direwolf's instincts. He'd never known Grey Wind to be shy of men, but he seemed uneasy near the bastard of Bolton, now legitimized. Let him keep his distance, Robb told himself. He was not foolish enough to bare his throat to a potential viper. They pressed on for 4 more days through rolling hills and low forests. Snow fell intermittently, piling up to the height of a man's calf in places. At night, they made camp in improvised shelters, or found old watchtowers to offer partial respite from the wind. Each sunrise was pale and short, sliding quickly into the long night. Despite the hardships, they met no enemies, only cold silence. Finally, on the 6th day out of Winterfell, Carhold rose on the horizon like a gray phantom. High walls of dark stone perched beside the icy waters of the Broken Branch, a river that snaked toward the shivering sea. Smoke rose faintly from inside the hold, indicating hearth fires. There were no banners flying from the towers, no bright sunburst of Karstark on a field of white. The gates stood shut, watchers perched on the battlements. As Robb's party drew closer, he spotted a handful of men peering down, crossbows in hand. He signaled a halt some 100 yards from the gate. Snow crunched as the group reined in. Gray wind prowled ahead a few steps, sniffing the air. Robb raised his voice, letting the wind carry his words. Lord Rickard Karstark, I am Robb Stark, king in the north, come in peace. Will you open your gates to me? His breath steamed, drifting upward. On the walls, a tall figure emerged, gripping the battlements. Even at a distance, Robb recognized the broad shoulders and long, gray-streaked hair of Rickard Karstark. He wore no helm, and his expression was etched with bitterness. He looked down with an unreadable gaze. Robb Stark, Karstark called, voice echoing off the stones. I wondered if you would come. I have, Robb said. I would speak with you, my lord. Will you grant me guest right in your hall? The older man paused, tension thick in the winter air. Men on the walls watched warily, crossbows half-raised. Midge Mormont's hand inched near her sword hilt. Ramsay Bolton stared ahead with a curious smile. Robb forced himself to remain motionless, trusting that Karstark would not open fire. Not yet. At length, Karstark's voice boomed again, colder than the wind. I grant you leave to enter, Robb Stark. You and a small escort, no more than 10. The rest can remain outside my walls. Robb exhaled softly, relief and apprehension mingling. Very well. He twisted in the saddle, telling half his men to remain behind, watchful. Then he beckoned to Midge Mormont and a handful of others he trusted, including Ramsay Bolton, though he would keep that man in sight at all times. Karstark's gates groaned open, revealing a courtyard of hard-packed snow. Robb and his chosen escort rode in, the rest of their party fanning out behind them on the plain. The gates rumbled shut, trapping them within. Robb felt Grey Wind's tension, the direwolf's hackles half-raised. Men in Karstark livery flanked the courtyard, eyeing the newcomers with hostility. At the far end, Rickard Karstark dismounted from an old warhorse. His face was stern, deeply lined, and his eyes held an edge of grief that had sharpened into rage over the months. Robb swung down from his saddle, stepping forward to meet him. My lord, he said carefully. Karstark regarded him with silence before speaking in a low, terse tone. Come inside. Better to speak before the hearth than in this cursed cold. Your men can stable their horses. He gestured curtly. Try no treachery. You'll find I'm not so forgiving as I once was. Robb nodded. We came to talk, not fight. Karstark turned and led them through a set of iron-banded doors into the main keep. The corridors were dim, lit by flickering torches and the faint glow of braziers. Tapestries depicting old Karstark victories hung on the walls, but the place felt neglected, as though its lord had lost interest in upkeep. Dust lingered in corners. The floor was scuffed and cold. At last, they emerged into a smaller hall. A single hearth burned at the far end, its flames licking around a log. A battered table and a handful of chairs were arranged around it. Karstark motioned them to stand or sit as they pleased, then took his own seat with a weary exhale. Robb, Midge Mormont, Ramsay Bolton, and the others remained half-standing, uncertain of Karstark's mood. "So," Karstark said, his voice rough, "the mighty king in the north pays a call on an old ally. And for what? To scold me for not kneeling when he commands? To beg me to forget my sons?" Robb's throat tightened at that. "I will never ask you to forget your loss, my lord. I only ask you to understand why I freed Jaime Lannister. We needed Sansa safe. We needed the war to end, for the good of the North." Karstark's fists clenched on the arms of his chair. "My sons died in service to you. Do you remember that? They followed you into battle. Harrion, Torrin, my blood. They died fighting the Kingslayer, and yet you let him go." A heavy silence fell. Meej Mormont's face hardened with sympathy, but she held her tongue. Ramsay stood to the side, leaning on a column with a faint, almost bored expression. Robb took a step closer to Karstark. "I remember them," he said quietly. "They died bravely. Their names are honored in Winterfell still." Karstark spat into the fire. "Honor means nothing to me now, only vengeance. You robbed me of that by releasing Lannister, that golden monster. He deserved to rot in a cell until the end of his days, or die by northern steel. You denied me that justice." Robb forced calm. "Lord Karstark, I did it to save my sister. If there had been another way, you could have marched on King's Landing and taken your sister by force." Karstark flung the words with unbridled anger. "You had the men, you had the momentum. Tywin Lannister was reeling after you captured Jaime. If you had pressed on, you might have ended them all. But instead, you turned craven, sued for peace, and left my sons unavenged." Robb stiffened. He recalled the nights he spent agonizing over that decision. The letters from his mother, the fear for Sansa's life, the knowledge that Tywin might crush them once he regrouped. "We would have lost thousands more men if we marched on King's Landing. Possibly lost the war entirely. If Tywin had the Tyrell support then as he does now, we'd be outnumbered, starved, and battered on every side. I couldn't risk all the North for vengeance. I chose to protect my family, my people. You know how my father taught me about duty." Karstark glowered. "Duty. My duty is to my blood. Without them, I have nothing." His voice dropped to a jagged whisper. "When you let Lannister go, you might as well have spat on their graves." A raw ache filled the air. Robb saw the man's grief, raw as a gaping wound, fueling an anger that threatened all reason. He let the hush stretch before trying again. "I won't pretend to ease your pain, but I beg you to see that we can't live in constant war. The North must stand together. If you break from me now, we only weaken ourselves. I came to ask you to remain loyal. I'll do whatever I can to honor your sons. But I can't bring them back, and I can't kill Jaime now." Karstark's head lifted, a flare of bitterness in his eyes. "You can't or you won't? I gave my word," Robb said through clenched teeth, "and I would never break it. What is the worth of a king's vow if I do?" Karstark let out a harsh laugh. "Ah, Ned Stark's son indeed. Honor above all. More fool you. What would your father have done if a man slaughtered his children? He would have demanded justice. I demand the same." A tight coil of dread snaked in Robb's stomach. He could see no easy way to appease Karstark. "Justice cannot always be served by the sword, my lord. If you leave us, the Greyjoys see weakness, and the Lannisters remain strong. Do you want the North subjugated anew? Do you want the sacrifices of your sons to be for nothing? Our unity is the only shield we have." Karstark stared at the fire, shoulders taut. He said nothing for a long moment, the flames highlighting the furrows in his brow. The crackling logs sounded unnaturally loud. At length, he spoke in a quieter, but no less intense tone. "You come here asking me to swallow my hatred. Perhaps you forget that my house is nearly undone. I have no surviving heirs but one, my daughter Alice, who is barely more than a girl. My family line teeters on the brink. And you want me to nod and say, 'Well done, King of the North, you have your sisters safe, so my grief doesn't matter?' I would never say your grief doesn't matter," Robb answered. I only say that continuing the war would have doomed many more families to the same loss. I made the choice I had to make, not the one I wanted. Karstark leaned forward in his chair, voice laced with loathing. If you had told me plainly, if you had let me handle the Kingslayer, maybe I could have found some solace. But you never gave me that chance. His gaze darted to Midge Mormont, then to Ramsay Bolton, then back to Robb. You come now to patch a wound that cannot be closed. Tell me, why should I bend the knee any longer, if you have already betrayed me? Midge Mormont bristled. Betrayed? Lord Karstark, your sons died in honorable battle under their rightful king. Vengeance is not the only path. Karstark's lips curled in scorn. Spare me your lectures, Mormont. I lost 2 sons. 2. If you lost Daisy, would you be so quick to accept it? Daisy Mormont, at Midge's side, set a hand on her mother's arm to keep her calm. Robb recognized the precariousness of the moment. We're not here to trade insults, Robb said. We come to find a way forward. Karstark pushed to his feet, looming though he was older and plainly haggard. A way forward, is it? Here is my way forward, your grace. Punish the Lannisters truly, or allow me to do so. Otherwise, your cause is nothing to me. You might as well style yourself the pup in the north. You speak of your father's honor, but even Ned Stark would have demanded blood for blood. If you cannot provide it, then I have nothing more to say. He turned away as if to end the audience. Robb felt a surge of desperation. If Rickard Karstark walked away, that could herald open revolt. Karhold was not the largest domain, but the symbolism would be devastating, and others might follow. He had not traveled all this way to fail. Robb stepped forward. My lord, if the Lannisters break their truce, if they so much as harm another Stark, I swear to you we will ride for justice. Karstark spun around, rage sparking. That's a hollow vow, lad. They've already murdered your father? Or have you forgotten? They butchered half the Tully host in the Riverlands. They destroyed countless villages. They killed my sons. What more must they do to earn your wrath? Robb's fists clenched. I have wrath enough for them, but I also have a duty to those still living. My father taught me that. A king who is sworn to protect thousands cannot throw them into the furnace of war for the sake of vengeance. I must weigh every life. I must weigh the safety of my own sisters, Sansa and Arya, if we find her, against that vengeance. He paused, letting the words sink in. I made my choice and I will bear it. I ask you, as a man who once fought beside me, to see reason. The Karstarks belong in the north. Stand with me still, and I will do all I can to honor your sons. Lay a tomb for them in Winterfell if you wish. I'll see the day we take down Tywin Lannister when the time is right. But not now. We are not strong enough now. Karstark's glare burned hot. Then his gaze slid to Ramsay Bolton, who lounged in the background like a bored cat. Something flickered in Karstark's eyes. You trust the Boltons, then? You trust them to keep your peace and protect the north? Ramsay only smirked. House Bolton serves the king in the north faithfully, he purred. We have no quarrel with Karhold. Karstark snorted. You're the bastard of the Dreadfort, or so they call you. A flayed man is never to be trusted. I see the father's cunning in your eyes. Ramsay's smile did not falter, but an edge gleamed in it. And I see a broken old man in yours. Robb interjected quickly. We are not here to quarrel, Bolton. Step back. Ramsay raised his hands in mock surrender, still smiling. Karstark shook his head, as if disgusted. The north is rotting from within. Look at you, boy king, trying to hold it all together. Bannermen, traitors, bastards, all squabbling while the real enemy feasts in King's Landing. My faith in your cause died when my sons died. Robb's temper frayed. He tried one last appeal. What would you have me do, my lord? Name your price if there is one. Karstark's voice turned low. Swear to me on the memory of your father that if ever the chance arises to slay Jaime Lannister or Tywin Lannister without dooming the north, you will not hesitate. That you will make them pay the blood price they owe. Robb looked into the man's eyes, reading the raw hunger for vengeance. Slowly, he inclined his head. I swear that I will bring them to justice if they break the treaty or if we ever have a chance that does not cost the North everything. They will see your sons avenged one day." Karstark exhaled, some fraction of his wrath receding. "Words, then. I have little left but to cling to them." He sank back into his chair, as though drained. "Very well, King in the North. I will not declare open defiance. For now, Karhold will remain loyal in name. But do not look for my banners when next you raise yours. I will not fight for you again." Robb swallowed. "My lord, Karstark held up a hand. "Enough. I have no more to say. Take what small victory you will. My men won't turn against Winterfell so long as you keep the peace. But do not expect me to ride to your call. That is as much as I'm willing to give." It was more concession than Robb expected, if far less than he had hoped. Stalemate. He wondered if time might soften Karstark's rage, if the passing of winter or the shifting of events might heal these wounds. For now, all he could do was accept. "Thank you, Lord Karstark," he said, swallowing bitterness. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly." Karstark did not reply, only stared into the fire as though searching for ghosts. After an awkward moment, Robb turned to his companions. "We'll take our leave." Meej Mormont gave Karstark a curt nod. Ramsay Bolton, however, bowed low and mockingly, a sly twist to his mouth. Karstark sneered but said nothing. It seemed the meeting was over. A hush followed them down the halls, through the courtyard, and back out the gates into the snow. The gates shut again with a clang, as though slamming shut the possibility of reconciliation. Robb and his escort rejoined their waiting men on the plain. No one spoke as they mounted. Gray wind whined softly, pawing at the snow. Robb shared a look of grim understanding with Meej Mormont. "That went as well as one could hope," Meej said in a resigned tone. "He's a wounded animal, that one." Ramsay Bolton gave a low laugh. "Wounded indeed. Beware a wounded beast." Robb nodded. "At least he won't openly rebel," he said as much. "But we haven't truly healed that rift. His hatred runs too deep. I doubt he'll come to our aid if war reignites. He might even side with our enemies if given the chance, though he said otherwise. Still, we avoid civil war for the moment." Meej adjusted the reins on her horse. "Then let us return to Winterfell. This was a fool's errand, but you had to try." Robb cast one last glance at Karhold's somber walls. Snow blew across the courtyard high above, swirling around the ramparts. Ricard Karstark's bitterness felt like a blade waiting to slip between the North's ribs. But for now it was sheathed. "Yes," Robb said wearily. "Let's go home." They spurred their horses, turning west, leaving Karhold behind in the cold hush. The journey back began in silence, each rider lost in thoughts of how easily the North might unravel if one grievous wound refused to mend. By the time Robb and his escort returned to Winterfell, another week had passed, and the snows had grown heavier. Towers and walls wore thick frosty caps. The courtyard's paths were shoveled anew each morning, but flakes drifted down steadily, gathering in corners and along parapets. When they arrived, the guard at the gates cheered half-heartedly to see the king in the North's return. Servants rushed to help stable the horses. Robb all but sagged in the saddle from weariness. The cold had seeped into his bones, and the gloom of his fruitless meeting weighed on his heart. Catelyn met him in the yard, thick cloak wrapped around her. Sansa lingered by her side, eyes wide with relief. "You're safe," Catelyn said, clasping his hands. "We worried. The snows have been so heavy. We feared you might be forced to shelter on the road. It was difficult, but we managed." Robb dismounted stiffly, glancing around at the swirl of activity. "We spoke to Lord Karstark. He won't rise against me, but neither will he lend his strength if war returns. His hatred is unyielding." Catelyn lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, my son. I know how that troubles you." "It does, but it's done." Robb exhaled. "We can't force him to come around. Best we keep the North as united as we can. Let Karstark brood. Perhaps in time he'll see reason, or fate will guide him otherwise." Sansa stepped forward hesitantly. as though she wanted to embrace her brother, but wasn't sure if she should in front of so many onlookers. Finally, she simply took his hand. "I'm glad you're back," she murmured. "You look so tired." Robb managed a small smile. "Just weary of traveling. I'll rest soon." Behind him, Meej Mormont and Ramsay Bolton approached. Catelyn acknowledged them with a polite nod. Bolton's presence drew uneasy glances from many in the courtyard. No one in Winterfell entirely trusted him. He gave Catelyn a slick half-bow. "My lady," he purred. Then, to Robb, "I'll see to the men's quarters, your grace, unless you have other commands." Robb shook his head. "That's fine, Bolton. Rest if you will." He watched the man slip away, a trailing swirl of black cloak and a faint smirk. Once he was gone, Catelyn's face showed concern. She leaned in to speak quietly. "How did he behave on the road? Roose Bolton's son has quite the reputation." Robb grimaced. "He was cooperative enough, though I don't trust him." He said little at Carhold, but he seemed to take satisfaction in Karstark's anger. "I'll keep him at arm's length." Catelyn sighed. "Yes, do. The Boltons are loyal so long as it benefits them. But we can manage that if we're vigilant." She stepped aside as two stable hands led Robb's horse away. Together, mother and son walked toward the great hall, Sansa following. The wind whipped snow across their faces. In that moment, Robb was fiercely grateful for the warmth of Winterfell, for the sight of Bran and Rickon through the hall's open doors, for the knowledge that here, at least, was a bastion of safety, fragile though it might be. When they entered the hall, the stone walls seemed to embrace them, the fires burning bright. Robb found himself craving a simple meal and some hours of sleep. Yet, as they crossed the threshold, the Great John hailed him from a bench near the dais. "Welcome back, your grace. Did you shake some sense into that old Karstark fool?" Robb shook his head ruefully. "We're not at war with him. That's all I'll say for now." The Great John huffed. "We'll take what we can get." Then he thrust a mug of hot mulled wine toward Robb. "Warm yourself with this." Robb accepted it, grateful for the spicy aroma. He took a long sip, letting the heat seep into his chest. Catelyn motioned to a servant to bring fresh bowls of stew. Sansa hovered near, as if wanting to watch over him, perhaps fearful that he might vanish again. Robb gave her a reassuring nod. He sat wearily at the table, listening to the bustle of Winterfell's evening meal. The hall was not full, but enough knights and stewards dined there, the low murmur of conversation providing a steady hum. The shadows danced on the walls, swirling with the torchlight. For a time, Robb let himself drift, savoring the simple pleasure of being home, safe, with a hot meal before him. Halfway through his stew, Sansa mustered the courage to speak in a near whisper, so only Robb and Catelyn could hear. "Is Karstark truly lost to us?" she asked. "He was always quiet when he visited father, but I never thought he could hate our family so." Robb stared into his bowl. "Grief changes men, Sansa. Sometimes it curdles into hatred. Father would have known how to handle him better, perhaps. But I did what I could." She laid a hand on his. "I understand. I wish we could bring back the ones we lost. Then none of this would have happened." Robb squeezed her hand gently, then let go, realizing others in the hall might notice. "So do I," he said, voice thick. "But we have to move forward." He set down his spoon, appetite waning. The bitterness of Karstark's words still echoed in his mind. Accusations of betrayal, demands for blood that Robb would not spill. Once, he had believed being king in the north would be a shining destiny, forging a proud new kingdom. Now, it felt like a chain around his neck, dragging him into every sorrow and grudge borne by his bannermen. That night, after the meal, he retired early. The moment he entered his old chambers, the memory of simpler days, nights spent as Ned Stark's heir, not yet the weary soldier king, threatened to overwhelm him. He shrugged off his cloak and boots, then collapsed onto the bed, letting gray wind curl near the hearth. Snow tapped against the shutters. Alone in the dim glow of a single candle, Robb closed his eyes. Carhold had not ended in disaster, But it had not ended in triumph either. House Karstark drifted somewhere between loyalty and quiet rebellion, their hearts full of resentment. The Lannisters still perched on the Iron Throne, no threat for now, but coiled and watchful. The Greyjoys lurked at sea, battered but unbroken, with Balon presumably seething over Asha's captivity. And winter had only just begun to grip the land. What if he had marched on King's Landing, as Karstark accused? He imagined the North's men battered by the Tyrell hosts, or trapped by cunning Lannister reinforcements, or starved on foreign fields. Sansa would likely have died in Joffrey's clutches. Arya, too, if she'd truly been in their reach at the time. No, that path led to ruin. He had done the only thing that might save at least part of his family. Yet the price was high. He could almost hear Ned Stark's voice in the hush. The hardest choices are the ones that shape us, Robb. Perhaps his father would have been proud, or perhaps he would have chosen differently. But Ned was gone, and Robb alone bore the burden. He opened his eyes, staring at the flicker of candlelight. So be it. He would stand firm. His final thought before sleep claimed him was a silent prayer for Arya, wherever she might be, for Jon at the wall, for the North under these snows, and for the fragile peace he had woven with the Lannisters. Let the storms rage outside. Let the hungry winds howl. Here in Winterfell, a single light burned in the darkness, kept alive by hope and duty. If the snows must come, then let them come. He would face them as a Stark of Winterfell, no matter what the morrow brought. In the weeks that followed, Winterfell sank into the rhythm of the cold season. Snow drifts climbed higher against the walls, and servants redoubled their efforts to keep the corridors warm. Life continued, albeit slowly. The Great Jon organized boar hunts in the nearby Wolfswood, bringing in fresh meat to supplement stored grain. Sansa and Catelyn oversaw mending circles, ensuring no one went without proper clothing. Bran and Rickon took their lessons with Maester Luwin in the Tower Library, reading about histories, genealogies, and the old songs of the North. Robb remained busy with the day-to-day tasks of rulership, but a strange calm settled. No new ravens from King's Landing threatened them. The Greyjoys were silent. Karstark brooded in his hold, but did not stir. The Dreadfort's men lingered at Winterfell or occasionally patrolled the surrounding land, under the watchful eye of Ser Roderick Castle. Ramsay Bolton kept to himself, sometimes vanishing for hours or days. His excuses varied, claiming to hunt or to inspect Bolton outposts. Robb did not trust him, but with the roads half-blocked by snow, there was little mischief Ramsay could manage without detection. And so the North waited, bracing for deeper winter, uncertain of the future. For once, time felt slow, as though the entire kingdom held its breath. One day, as the pale sun reached its zenith, a lone raven arrived, bearing the seal of the Eyrie. It was addressed to Catelyn Stark. The messenger who carried it through the snow had nearly frozen, but insisted on delivering it into her hands. She opened the scroll in the presence of Robb and Sansa, her brow furrowing. "It's from my sister Lisa," she murmured. "She writes from the Eyrie." Robb felt a flicker of surprise. "We've heard little from the Vale since the war began. They chose to remain behind their mountains." Catelyn scanned the letter. Her face betrayed annoyance, then confusion, then a trace of worry. "She congratulates us on concluding peace with the Lannisters, though she says she would never have made such a pact had the Vale been threatened. She also says she has news of Arya." Robb started forward. "Arya?" Sansa's breath caught, her eyes going round. "What does she say?" Catelyn's lips tightened. That a girl answering Arya's description might have passed through the Riverlands in the company of a band of outlaws. Some rumor placed her near the bloody gate of the Vale, but Lisa claims not to have found her. It's all second-hand whispers. She wants to know if we've had any word. She also hints that if we do learn of Arya's location, we should consider sending her to the Eyrie for safekeeping. Lisa insists the Vale is safer than the North right now. Robb's mind reeled. She might be alive then. We suspected it but had no solid proof. If she traveled near the Vale and then vanished, gods only know where she's gone since. Sansa's eyes shimmered with tears. Arya, she whispered, voice breaking. I knew she wouldn't let them catch her. She's so fierce, so brave. Catelyn's expression wavered between hope and exasperation. Arya's resourceful, but she's still a child, out there in a realm torn by war and outlaws. I pray the gods keep her safe. Robb raked a hand through his auburn hair. We must send out more inquiries. We might write to the Brotherhood without banners. There's talk of them in the Riverlands, or any loyal Tully bannermen near the Vale's borders. If Arya's truly heading that way, we can guide her north. Catelyn nodded, setting the letter aside. Yes, I'll compose letters to Edmure and to the Eyrie both, asking for any concrete sightings. Lisa's letter is frustratingly vague, but it's a shred of hope. They exchanged a look of subdued optimism. Arya might be alive, another piece of the future that hung uncertain. The letter changed little about their daily routines, but it lit a tiny candle of faith in their hearts. Outside, the snow deepened. Weeks slid by in quiet, broken only by rumors and small crises. An outbreak of fever in a nearby village, wild wolves harrying travelers, a collapsed roof in one of Winterfell's lesser towers. Robb managed them all, thankful that no great armies threatened the walls. This hush was the reward of the treaty, the uneasy respite from the War of the Five Kings. Yet the real beyond the north was anything but tranquil. Ravens trickled in from the Riverlands, telling of the royal wedding in King's Landing, of rumors that Stannis still plotted at Dragonstone, and of the uneasy alliance between the Lannisters and Tyrells. Each letter reminded Robb that the Game of Thrones did not pause simply because the North had stepped back. Westeros still boiled with intrigue. One misstep, one shift in power, and the fragile peace could shatter. Then, at last, a raven arrived from Riverrun, sealed with the Tully fish. Catelyn read it, brow creasing. She handed it to Robb. His eyes flicked over the parchment. It bore Edmure's hasty scrawl. To Robb Stark, King in the North. I pray this letter finds you well. Great tidings from King's Landing. Joffrey Baratheon is dead, poisoned at his wedding feast. Word travels fast, and the realm is in uproar. The Lannisters accuse Tyrion Lannister of the deed, or so rumor claims. Tywin Lannister is said to be furious, the Tyrells shocked. I cannot guess how this might affect the truce with the North. I advise caution. The Boy King's death could provoke a new wave of conflict, especially if the blame falls on others. Already, the Riverlands hold their breath. Hold your peace. Let me know your will. Signed, Edmure Tully, Lord of Riverrun. Robb stared at the words, heartbeat thudding. Joffrey, dead? The vicious Boy King who had tormented Sansa, who had commanded Ned Stark's execution. Robb had nursed a quiet hatred for him, but never expected him to fall so soon, and certainly not like this. Poisoned at his own wedding feast? Sounded like a fable. Yet if it were true, it changed everything. He set the letter aside, looking at Catelyn. We sought justice for father's death. Someone else has delivered it. She pressed her lips together. We must be careful. Tywin Lannister will not be undone so easily. If Joffrey is gone, the throne passes to his younger brother, Tommen, I believe. Or the Tyrells might push for another arrangement. Either way, they won't want the North taking advantage. They'll be on guard. Sansa, who had come upon them while they read, stood pale. Joffrey is gone? She whispered. Poisoned. She swayed slightly, remembering the wedding that was once meant to be hers. The gods are good, she whispered, but her face showed more shock than satisfaction. I never imagined he could die like that. Will they blame me? She asked suddenly, voice trembling. I was his former betrothed. I was always afraid. Robb squeezed her shoulder gently. No one in King's Landing can blame you, Sansa. You're safe here. Catelyn's eyes sparked with worry. Tywin might spin it any which way if it suits him, but from what Edmure's letter suggests, they've pinned the crime on Tyrion Lannister. For all we know, the truth is more complicated. But that's not our concern. Not unless they claim we had a hand in it. Robb paused, thinking of the precarious treaty. Would Tywin break our peace over this? If he thinks we might exploit the chaos, he could strike first. Catelyn shook her head slowly. Tywin is cunning. With Joffrey dead, he'll want stability, not a new war. He has a new young king to protect Tommen and the Tyrells as allies. They'll want to preserve the realm. War with the North gains them nothing, especially in winter. I suspect they'll double down on the truce, at least until they've settled the dust. Robb let out a breath. So perhaps our peace stands, ironically enough. Still, we must watch carefully. I'll send a raven to Edmure, telling him to hold the Riverlands quietly. We make no moves unless the Lannisters do. They agreed on the plan. Sansa stood silent, processing the news. Joffrey was gone. Part of her must have felt relief, but her face betrayed confusion and lingering fear. She eventually bowed her head and whispered, "The world changes so quickly." Yes, Robb thought it did. They had sought vengeance for Ned Stark, and in a cruel twist of fate, some stranger's poison had taken Joffrey's life at a wedding. Perhaps the gods had their own sense of justice, or perhaps it was merely mortal intrigue. Either way, the realm would reel from this event. The king in the north would do best to stand aside and let the south devour itself, as the snows closed in around Winterfell. Yet that night, as Robb lay awake in his chamber, the flicker of candlelight playing on the stone, he felt uneasy. Joffrey was gone, but Tywin Lannister remained. If Tommen Baratheon took the throne, the power of House Lannister and House Tyrell might solidify. And if they saw the North as a threat, if they feared a reemergence of the young wolf, they could muster all the South against him in time. The treaty might hold for a season or for years, or it might shatter tomorrow. He heard gray wind stir from the hearth. The dire wolf lifted his great head, ears pricked, as though sensing the swirl of thoughts. Robb reached down and scratched behind Grey Wind's ears, finding a sliver of comfort in the warm fur. "We did what we could," he murmured. "We have to live with the consequences. Father, watch over us." The fire crackled low, the cold pressing in. Outside, winter's night stretched long and dark, filled with unknown paths. But Winterfell's walls stood, and the memory of Ned Stark guided Robb's choices. Perhaps that would be enough to weather the storms yet to come. And thus, the North held its breath through the tail end of that war-torn year. Joffrey Baratheon's death echoed across the Seven Kingdoms like thunder, but the thunder rolled far to the south, and in the north it arrived only as a distant rumble. Tywin Lannister and his court rearranged the pieces of power, proclaiming Tommen Baratheon as king. The Tyrells bent eagerly, seeking new arrangements for the young boy's betrothal. Stannis brooded still, rumors claiming he sought the favor of northern mountain clans near the wall. The Ironborn remained sullen behind their waves, still deprived of Asha Greyjoy's leadership. House Karstark glowered in isolation, and the Starks, though fractured, guarded a tenuous peace. Yet, within the gloom, there remained hope. Sansa breathed freely each day in Winterfell, free from King's Landing's horrors. Bran followed his dreams of wolves and ravens, searching for meaning in the old god's realm. Rickon grew taller, bounding through snowy courtyards behind Shaggy Dog. Robb led them, no longer the reckless young wolf, but a man tempered by heartbreak, forced to choose diplomacy over vengeance, and forging a shield of unity for his kingdom. He had set Jaime Lannister free to secure Sansa's safety, a gamble that had succeeded, yet carried lasting consequences. If war flared again, Robb would face it with the knowledge that half the realm might remain suspicious or bitter. But for now, the swords lay quiet. Night after night, the snows fell, thick and heavy, cloaking Winterfell's towers in white. In the Godswood, the old weirwood stood silent under its snowy branches, the face carved in the trunk watching with calm acceptance. Sometimes Robb would walk there, Sansa or Catelyn beside him, to pray or to remember. He thought of Arya, lost in the wide world, imagined her forging her own path back home. He thought of Jon on the wall, of the dangers creeping beyond. He thought of his father, whose memory lived in every stone of Winterfell. And he thought of the future, uncertain but still open. A future where the North might stand strong, if only they could hold the fragile peace that had been so dearly bought. The realm might spin on, full of treachery and shifting alliances, but here, at least, the Stark hearth glowed with warmth. The war was over, perhaps not forever, but for a season. One day the snows would melt. One day the world would call them to arms again, or present them a new test. Until then, they had this respite, this moment to gather strength, to rebuild their hearts and their home. For a time, that would have to be enough. In the stillness of a northern winter, the Starks endured, guided by duty and bound by love, carrying forward the stubborn hope that someday, all of them might stand together again beneath the walls of Winterfell, victorious not through vengeance, but through survival, loyalty, and the mercy that Ned Stark had once taught them to cherish above the howling darkness.